The journey. To write about Jack and his cottage and his garden, it was necessary for me to have lived a second life in the valley and to have had a second awakening to the natural world there. But a version of that story, came to me just days after I came to the valley, to the cottage in the manor grounds. The cottage at that time still had the books and some of the furniture of the people who had been there before. Among the books was one that was very small, a paperback booklet, smaller in format than the average small paperback and with only a few pages. The booklet, from a series called The Little Library of Art, was about the early paintings of Giorgio de Chirico. There were about a dozen reproductions of his early surrealist paintings. Technically, in these very small reproductions, the paintings did not seem interesting, they seemed flat, facile. And their content was not profound either, arbitrary assemblages, in semi-classical, semi-modern settings, of unrelated motifs, aqueducts, trains, arcades, gloves, fruit, statues, with an occasional applied touch of easy mystery, in one painting, for instance, an overlarge shadow of a hidden figure approaching from round a corner. But among these paintings there was one which, perhaps because of its title, caught my attention, The Enigma of Arrival. I felt that in an indirect, poetical way the title referred to something in my own experience, and later I was to learn that the titles of these surrealist paintings of Chirico's hadn't been given by the painter, but by the poet Apollinaire, who died young in 1918, from influenza following a war wound, to the great grief of Picasso and others. What was interesting about the painting itself, The Enigma of Arrival, was that, again perhaps because of the title, it changed in my memory. The original, or the reproduction in the Little Library of Art booklet, was always a surprise. A classical scene, Mediterranean, ancient Roman, or so I saw it. A wharf, in the background, beyond walls and gateways, like cutouts, there is the top of the mast of an antique vessel. On an otherwise deserted street in the foreground there are two figures, both muffled, one perhaps the person who has arrived, the other perhaps a native of the port. The scene is of desolation and mystery. It speaks of the mystery of arrival. It spoke to me of that, as it had spoken to Apollinaire. And in the winter grey of the manor grounds in Wiltshire, in those first 4 days of mist and rain, when so little was clear to me, an idea, floating lightly above the book I was working on, came to me of a story I might one day write about that scene in the Chirico picture. My story was to be set in classical times, in the Mediterranean. My narrator would write plainly, without any attempt at period style or historical explanation of his period. He would arrive, for a reason I had yet to work out, at that classical port with the walls and gateways like cutouts. He would walk past that muffled figure on the quayside. He would move from that silence and desolation, that blankness, to a gateway or door. He would enter there and be swallowed by the life and noise of a crowded city. I imagined something like an Indian bazaar scene. The mission he had come on, family business, study, religious initiation, would give him encounters and adventures. He would enter interiors, of houses and temples. Gradually there would come to him a feeling that he was getting nowhere. He would lose his sense of mission. He would begin to know only that he was lost. His feeling of adventure would give way to panic. He would want to escape, to get back to the quayside and his ship. But he wouldn't know how. I imagined some religious ritual in which, led on by kindly people, he would unwittingly take part and find himself the intended victim. At the moment of crisis he would come upon a door, open it, and find himself back on the quayside of Arrival. He has been saved. The world is as he remembered it. Only one thing is missing now. Above the cutout walls and buildings there is no mast, no sail. The antique ship has gone. The traveler has lived out his life. I didn't think of this as an historical story, but more as a free ride of the imagination. There was to be no research. I would take pointers from Virgil perhaps for the sea and travel and the seasons, from the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles for the feel of the municipal or provincial organization of the Roman Empire. I would get moods and the idea of ancient religion from Apuleius. Horace and Martial and Petronius would give me hints for social settings. The idea of living in my imagination in that classical Roman world was attractive to me. A beautiful, clear, dangerous world, far removed from the setting in which I had found myself. The story, more a mood than a story, so different from the book on which I was working. A taxing book, it had been occupying me for 8 or 9 months and I still hadn't completed a draft. At the center of the book I was writing was a story set in an African country, once a colony, with white and Asian settlers, and now independent. It was the story of a day-long journey made in a car by 2 white people at a time of tribal war, suddenly overwhelming colonial order and simplicity. Africa had given both those white people a chance, made them bigger, brought out their potential. Now, when they were no longer so young, it was consuming them. It was a violent book, not violent in its incidents, but in its emotions. It was a book about fear. All the jokes were silenced by this fear. And the mist that hung over the valley where I was writing, the darkness that came early, the absence of knowledge of where I was, all this uncertainty emanating from the valley I transferred to my Africa. And it did not occur to me that the story of the Enigma of Arrival, a sunlit sea journey ending in a dangerous classical city, which had come to me as a kind of release from the creative rigors and the darkness of my own African story, it did not occur to me that that Mediterranean story was really no more than a version of the story I was already writing. Nor did it occur to me that it was also an attempt to find a story to give coherence to, a dream or nightmare which for a year or so had been unsettling me. In this dream there occurred always, at a critical moment in the dream narrative, what I can only describe as an explosion in my head. It was how every dream ended, with this explosion that threw me flat on my back, in the presence of people, in a street, a crowded room, or wherever, threw me into this degraded posture in the midst of standing people, threw me into the posture of sleep in which I found myself when I awakened. The explosion was so loud, so reverberating and slow in my head that I felt, with the part of my brain that miraculously could still think and draw conclusions, that I couldn't possibly survive, that I was in fact dying, that the explosion this time, in this dream, regardless of the other dreams that had revealed themselves at the end as dreams, would kill, that I was consciously living through, or witnessing, my own death. And when I awoke my head felt queer, shaken up, exhausted, as though some discharge in my brain had in fact occurred. This dream or nightmare or internal dramatization, perhaps a momentary turbulence in my brain had created the split-second tableau of the street, the cafe, the party, the bus, where I collapsed in the presence of people, had been with me for a year or more. It was a dream that had been brought on by intellectual fatigue and something like grief. I had written a lot, done work of much difficulty, had worked under pressure more or less since my school days. Before the writing, there had been the learning. Writing had come to me slowly. Before that, there had been Oxford, and before that, the school in Trinidad where I had worked for the Oxford scholarship. There had been a long preparation for the writing career. And then I discovered that to be a writer was not, as I had imagined, a state of competence, or achievement, or fame, or content, at which one arrived and where one stayed. There was a special anguish attached to the career, whatever the labor of any piece of writing, whatever its creative challenges and satisfactions, time had always taken me away from it. And with time passing, I felt mocked by what I had already done. It seemed to belong to a time of vigor, now past for good. Emptiness, restlessness built up again, and it was necessary once more, out of my internal resources alone, to start on another book, to commit myself to that consuming process again. I had finally been undermined. My spirit had broken, and that breaking of the spirit had occurred not long before I had come to the valley. For 2 years I had worked on an historical book about the region where I had been born. The book had grown, and since, beyond a certain length, a big book is harder to write, more exhausting, than a shorter one, I had resisted its growth. But then I had become excited by the story it told. The historian seeks to abstract principles from human events. My approach was the other. For the 2 years that I lived among the documents, I sought to reconstruct the human story as best I could. It was a labor. 10 or 12 documents, called up from memory, almost like personal memories, might provide the details for a fairly short and simple paragraph of narrative. But I was supported by my story, the themes it touched on: discovery, the New World, the dispeopling of the discovered islands, slavery, the creation of the plantation colony, The coming of the idea of revolution, the chaos after revolutions in societies so created. A great packed education those 2 years had been. And I had such faith in what I was writing, such faith in the grandeur of my story, that I thought it would find the readers that my books of the previous 12 years had not found. And I behaved foolishly. Without waiting for that response, I dismantled the little life I had created for myself in England and prepared to leave, to be a free man. For years, in that far-off island whose human history I had been discovering and writing about, I had dreamed of coming to England. But my life in England had been savourless, and much of it mean. I had taken to England all the rawness of my colonial's nerves, and those nerves had more or less remained, nerves which in the beginning were in a good part also the nerves of youth and inexperience, physical and sexual inadequacy, and of undeveloped talent. And just as once at home I had dreamed of being in England, so for years in England I had dreamed of leaving England. Now, 18 years after my first arrival, it seemed to me that the time had come. I dismantled the life I had bit by bit established, and prepared to go. The house I had bought and renovated in stages I sold, and my furniture and books and papers went to the warehouse. The calamity occurred 4 months later. The book in which I had placed such faith, the book which had exhausted me so much, could not please the publisher who had commissioned it. We had misunderstood one another. He knew only my name, he did not know the nature of my work. And I had misunderstood his interest in me. He had approached me as a serious writer, but he had wanted only a book for tourists, something much simpler than the book I had written, something at once more romantic and less romantic, at once more human and less human. So I found myself up in the air. And I had to return to England. That journey back, from the island and continent I had gone to see with my new vision, the corner of the new world I had just written about, from there to the United States and Canada, and then to England, that journey back to England so mimicked and parroted the journey of 19 years before, the journey of the young man, the boy almost, who had journeyed to England to be a writer, in a country where the calling had some meaning, that I couldn't but be aware of all the cruel ironies. It was out of this grief, too deep for tears or rage, grief that began partly to be expressed in the dream of the exploding head, that I began to write my African story, which had come to me as a wisp of an idea in Africa 3 or 4 years before. The African fear with which as a writer I was living day after day, the unknown Wiltshire, the cruelty of this return to England, the dread of a second failure, the mental fatigue. All of this, rolled into one, was what lay on the spirit of the man who went on the walks down to Jack's cottage and past it. Not an observer merely, a man removed, but a man played on, worked on, by many things. And it was out of that burden of emotion that there had come to the writer, as release, as an idyll, the ship's story, the antique quayside story, suggested by the Enigma of Arrival, an idea that came innocently, without the writer suspecting how much of his life, how many aspects of his life, that remote story, still just an idea for a story, carried. But that is why certain stories or incidents suggest themselves to writers, or make an impression on them. That is why writers can appear to have obsessions. I went for my walks every afternoon. I finished my book. The panic of its composition didn't repeat in the revision. I was beginning to heal. And more than heal. For me, a miracle had occurred in this valley and in the grounds of the manor where my cottage was. In that unlikely setting, in the ancient heart of England, a place where I was truly an alien, I found I was given a second chance, a new life, richer and fuller than any I had had anywhere else. And in that place, where at the beginning I had looked only for remoteness and a place to hide, I did some of my best work. I traveled, I wrote. I ventured out, brought back experiences to my cottage, and wrote. The years passed. I healed. The life around me changed. I changed. And then one afternoon came that choking fit as I was walking past Jack's old cottage, Jack himself long dead. A few hours later came the serious illness which that choking fit had presaged. And when after some months I recovered, I found myself a middle-aged man. Work became harder for me. I discovered in myself an unwillingness to undertake new labor. I wished to be free of labor. And whereas when I came to the valley my dream was the dream provoked by fatigue and unhappiness, the dream of the exploding head, the certainty of death, now it was the idea of death itself that came to me in my sleep. Death not as a tableau or a story, as in the earlier dream, but death, the end of things, as a gloom that got at a man, sought out his heart, when he was at his weakest, while he slept. This idea of death, death the nullifier of human life and endeavor, to which morning after morning I awakened, so enervated me that it sometimes took me all day, all the hours of daylight, to see the world as real again, to become a man again, a doer. The dream of exhaustion once, now the debilitation brought on by involuntary thoughts of the final emptiness. This too was something that happened to the man who went walking, witness of people and events in the valley. It was as though the calling, the writer's vocation, was one that could never offer me anything but momentary fulfillment. So that again, years after I had seen the Kiriko picture and the idea for the story had come to me, again, in my own life, was another version of the story of the Enigma of Arrival. And indeed there had been a journey long before, the journey that had seeded all the others, and had indirectly fed that fantasy of the classical world. There had been a journey, and a ship. This journey began some days before my 18th birthday. It was the journey which, for a year, I feared I would never be allowed to make. So that even before the journey I lived with anxiety about it. It was the journey that took me from my island, Trinidad, off the northern coast of Venezuela, to England. There had, first, been an airplane, a small one of the period, narrow, with a narrow aisle, and flying low. This had given me my first revelation, the landscape of my childhood seen from the air, and from not too high up. At ground level so poor to me, so messy, so full of huts and gutters and bare front yards and straggly hibiscus hedges and shabby backyards, views from the roadside. From the air, though, a landscape of logic and larger pattern, the straight lines and regularity and woven, carpet-like texture of sugarcane fields, so extensive from up there, leaving so little room for people, except at the very edges, the large, unknown area of swampland, curiously still, the clumps of mangrove and brilliant green swamp trees casting black shadows on the milky green water, the forested peaks and dips and valleys of the mountain range, a landscape of clear pattern and contours, absorbing all the roadside messiness, a pattern of dark green and dark brown, like camouflage, like a landscape in a book, like the landscape of a real country. So that at the moment of takeoff, almost the moment of departure, the landscape of my childhood was like something which I had missed, something I had never seen. Minutes later, the sea. It was wrinkled, as in the fragment of the poem by Tennyson. It glinted in the sun, it was gray and silver rather than blue, and again, as in the fragment by Tennyson, it did crawl. So that again the world in which I had lived all my life so far was a world I had never seen. And then the little airplane rose just above the clouds and flew like that, just above the clouds, until we reached Puerto Rico. I had heard about the beauty of the clouds seen from the top from someone who had traveled to Jamaica, perhaps in an even smaller airplane, 5 years before. So this was a beauty and an experience which I was ready for, and was overwhelmed by. Always, above the cloud, the sun. So solid the cloud, so pure. I could only look and look, truly to possess that beauty, to feel that one had come to the end of that particular experience, was impossible. To see what so few men had seen. Always there, the thing seen, the world above the clouds, even when unperceived. Up there, as down below, sometimes at sunset, one's mind could travel back and forward eons. We droned on to Puerto Rico. It was late afternoon. Another country, already, after only a few hours. Travel. Another language. People of mixed race, mulattoes, but subtly different from the mixed people of my own place. There was a Negro in the hangar. Or so the place seemed to me. There was no airport terminal to speak of. Air travel, though a luxury, still had in those days a rough and ready side. The Negro was from the little airplane. I asked him whether he was from Trinidad. Of course he was. I knew that. I had seen him in the plane. But I asked him, why? Friendship? I didn't need that. I noted the falsity in my behavior. In the hangar or shed there was a man from another plane, or waiting for another plane, who was reading that day's edition of the New York Times. This large world had always existed outside my little island, like the sun above the clouds, always there, even when unperceived. And this large world was now within reach. For 8 hours, or was it 13, we drove on in a dark sky to New York. Hours away from the life of my island, where nothing had savor, and even the light had a life-killing quality. As I thought, I lived, like any peasant coming for the first time to a capital city, in a world of marvels. I had always known that this world existed, but to find it available to me only for the price of a fare was nonetheless staggering. With the marvels, however, there went, as in a fairy story, a feeling of menace. As the little plane droned and droned through the night, the idea of New York became frightening. Not the city so much as the moment of arrival. I couldn't visualize that moment. It was the first traveler's panic I had experienced. The passenger beside me was an Englishwoman. She had a child with her. I saw them only in that way, an Englishwoman and a child. I had no means of placing them. I wrote my diary. I had bought, for that purpose, a cheap little lined pad with a front cover that held envelopes in a pocket. I also had an indelible, mauve pencil, of the sort that serious people, especially officials, in Trinidad, used in those days. When you licked the pencil, the color became bright. Dry, the color was dull. I had bought the pad and the pencil because I was traveling to become a writer, and I had to start. I asked the stewardess to sharpen my pencil. I did so partly to taste the luxuriousness of air travel. The plane was small, but it offered many little services, or so the airline advertisements said. This request to the stewardess was in the nature of a challenge, and to my amazement the stewardess, white and American and to me radiant and beautiful and adult, took my request seriously, brought the pencil back beautifully sharpened, and called me, 2 weeks away from being 18, sir. So I wrote my diary. But it left out many of the things that were worth noting down, many of the things which, some years later, I would have thought much more important than the things I did note down. The diary I wrote in the airplane left out the great family farewell at the airport in Trinidad, the airport building like a little timber house with a little garden at the edge of the asphalt runway. That family farewell was the last of the big Hindu or Asiatic occasions in which I took part, those farewells, from another era, another continent, another kind of travel, when a traveler might indeed never return, as many of us, or our grandfathers, had never returned to India, for which people left their work, gave up a day's earnings, and traveled long distances to say goodbye. And not really to say goodbye, more to show themselves, to be present at a big clan occasion, to assert their membership of the clan, in spite of the fact, or because of the fact, that there were now such differences between various branches of the extended family, and conversation was already touched with condescension or social nervousness on one side or the other. I did not note down that occasion in my writer's diary with the indelible pencil sharpened by the elegant Pan American World Airways stewardess in the little airplane. And one reason was that the occasion was too separate from the setting in which I wrote, the setting of magic and wonder. Another was that the occasion, that ceremonial farewell with stiff little groups of people hanging about the wooden building at the edge of the runway, did not fit into my idea of a writer's diary or the writer's experience I was preparing myself for. Nor did I write about, something I would certainly have written about, not many years later, when I had begun to work towards some understanding of the nature of my experience, the cousin and his advice at the airport. This cousin was a half-witted or certainly dim-witted fellow who had developed a little paunch at the age of 15 or so, had kept it ever since, and had in some bizarre way, without any knowledge of grammar or feeling for the English language or any other language, made himself a journalist. He had no goodwill towards me. Perhaps he even had ill will. Perhaps he would have easily, not out of any positive malice, but half-heartedly, as befitted his character, and out of a simple principle of family hate, done the equivalent of sticking pins in my effigy. But he was moved by the occasion, or felt he had to act up to it. And at that crowded farewell at the airport, where a few people, some of whom I didn't know, were even managing to cry, this cousin came up to me and, as though passing on a secret, handed to him, a journalist, from the highest quarters, from the airport manager, from the director of Pan American World Airways, or from God himself, whispered, "Sit at the back of the airplane. It's safer there." Travel was still an adventure, by sea or by air. And it may be that what my cousin said about sitting at the back of the airplane was right. Perhaps, though, and more likely, his advice was based on the child's comic strip idea of the airplane crash, the plane diving down, crashing on its nose. I didn't write about this cousin and his advice in my airplane diary, because, like the family send-off, the remnant of peasant Asia in my life, the frivolous advice did not seem to me suitable to the work, which was about a more epic vision of the world and about a more epic kind of personal adventure. Perhaps it never even occurred to me to write about the farewell or the cousin's advice. There was no question of rejecting the themes. But though personal adventure was my theme, I was in no position to write about something more important, the change in my personality that travel and solitude had already begun to bring about. The intimations of this alteration were very slight. In 5 years I was to see very clearly that the family farewell and my cousin's advice were material. But it was to be many years after that before the alterations in my personality, or the slight intimations I was beginning to have about those alterations, intimations that were minute fractions of that first day's adventure, were to acquire their proper proportions. There had been the Negro in the hangar or airport shed in Puerto Rico where, after many hours, and in the late afternoon, our little airplane had made its first halt. Already the light had changed. The world had changed. The world had ceased to be colonial, for me. People had already altered their value, even this Negro. He was bound for Harlem. At home, among his fellows, just a few hours before, he was a man to be envied, his journey indescribably glamorous. Now he was a Negro, in a straw-colored jacket obviously not his own, too tight across his weight-lifter's shoulder. Weight-lifting was a craze among us. Now, in that jacket, at home, the badge of the traveler to the temperate north, he was bluffing it out, insisting on his respectability, on not being an American Negro, on not being fazed by the airplane and by the white people. He was not an educated man, not someone I would have sought out at home. Yet already I had sought him out, and even claimed kinship with him. Why? I felt the gestures of friendship to be false even as I made them. In his tight, respectable jacket, he was cool with me. And I was half glad he was, because friendship, chat, with him wasn't what I wanted. But I had made the gestures. If I had been asked whether I was feeling solitary, vulnerable, I would have said that the opposite was true, that I was in a state of great excitement, that I was loving everything, that everything I had seen so far in the second half of that great day was new and wonderful. He was cool, the Trinidad man, buttoned up, his eyes quiet, no shine to his color, which had rather a matte or dead quality that spoke of tension. I let him be. I stayed by myself. The light yellowed, darkened. Then we were airborne again. The little airplane droned on and on. The repetitiveness of this form of travel was an unexpected revelation. So that though the journey was the fastest I had ever made, and though I knew that compared with a ship's journey it was extraordinarily short, yet it was neither exaggerated nor pretentious to feel that it was boring. There were the woman and her child beside me. The woman was English, as I have said. I had never met an Englishwoman of her age before, had indeed met only one Englishwoman, and had no means of reading her character or intelligence or education. I was not interested in children, was not interested in women with children. Yet towards this woman, much taken up with her child, I found myself making overtures of friendship. I was carrying some bananas to New York. They were in a paper bag, perhaps on the floor. Some remnant of old peasant travel, with food for the journey, some genuine Hindu distrust of the food that might be offered by the airplane and then by the hotel in New York. The bananas were smelling now. In the warm plain they were ripening by the hour. I offered the woman a banana. Did she take it for her child? I cannot remember. The fact was, I made the offer. Though really, I didn't want this woman's friendship or conversation, and was not interested in the child. Was there some fear of travel, in spite of my longing for the day, and in spite of my genuine excitement? Was this reaching out to people a response to solitude, since for the first time in my life I was solitary? Was it the fear of New York? Certainly. The city, my behavior there at the moment of arrival, my inability to visualize the physical details of arrival, how and where I was going to spend the night, these were developing anxieties as we flew on and on. I witnessed this change in my personality, but, not even aware of it as a theme, wrote nothing of it in my diary. So that between the man writing the diary and the traveler there was already a gap between the man and the writer. Man and writer were the same person. But that is a writer's greatest discovery. It took time, and how much writing, to arrive at that synthesis. On that day, the first of adventure and freedom and travel and discovery, man and writer were united in their eagerness for experience. But the nature of the experiences of the day encouraged a separation of the two elements in my personality. The writer, or the boy traveling to be a writer, was educated. He had had a formal school education. He had a high idea of the nobility of the calling to which he was traveling to dedicate himself. But the man, of whom the writer was just a part, if a major, impelling part, the man was in the profoundest way, as a social being, untutored. He was close to the village ways of his Asian Indian community. He had an instinctive understanding of and sympathy for its rituals, like the farewell at the airport that morning. He was close to the ways of that community, which was separated from peasant India only by 2 or 3 generations in a plantation colony of the New World. Yet there was another side to the man. He did not really participate in the life or rituals of that community. It wasn't only that he was educated in the formal way of a school education, he was also skeptical. Unhappy in his extended family, he was distrustful of larger, communal groupings. But that half-Indian world, that world removed in time and space from India, and mysterious to the man, its language not even half understood, its religion and religious rites not grasped, that half-Indian world was the social world the man knew. It was all that he had outside school and the life of the imagination fed by books and the cinema. That village world had given him its prejudices and passions. He was interested in, had been passionate about, the politics of India before and after independence. Yet he knew little about his community in Trinidad. He thought that because he belonged to it he understood it. He thought that the life of the community was like an extension of the life of his family. And he knew nothing of other communities. He had only the prejudices of his time, in that colonial, racially mixed setting. He was profoundly ignorant. He hadn't been to a restaurant, hated the idea of eating food from foreign hands. Yet at the same time he had dreamed of fulfillment in a foreign country. He looked for adventure. On this first day he found it. But he also came face to face with his ignorance. This ignorance undermined, mocked the writer, or the ambition of the writer, made nonsense of the personality the writer wished to assume, elegant, knowing, unsurprised. Like Somerset Maugham. Or, a truer comparison, like the Trinidad Negro with the tight borrowed jacket in the hangar or shed at Puerto Rico, on his way to Harlem, and quite another idea of glamour. So my memories of my arrival late at night in New York are vague. I think back hard now, and certain details become clearer. A very bright building, dazzling lights, a little crowd in a small space, a woman official with a very sharp, American, accent calling out the names of certain passengers. There was a letter for me. A man from the British consulate should have met me. But the plane had been so delayed he had gone home, leaving this letter, which gave me only the name of the hotel he had booked me into. He should have protected me. He left me at the mercy of the taxi driver who took me into the city. The driver cheated me, charged too much, and then, seeing how easily I acquiesced, he stripped me of the few remaining dollars I had on me. I had a few more, very few, hidden in my suitcase, by claiming them as a tip. I felt this humiliation so keenly that memory blurred it soon, and then eradicated it for many years. I preferred to remember the taxi driver as being talkative, because that was the way taxi drivers were. I worked hard at remembering what he had said. We sold the Japs all our scrap metal and they shot it right back at us. And I remembered the Negro, he must have occurred in the hotel, who talked like a Negro in a book or film. This city never sleeps. Or this city show don't sleep, man. And whom I couldn't tip because I had no money on me. The talkative taxi driver, the quaintly spoken Negro. I cherished them because I felt I knew them, because I felt they were confirming so much of what I had read, were confirming so much of my advance information. They reassured me that I was indeed traveling, and was already in New York. And in their familiar aspect they were material, suitable for the writer. But the humiliation connected with each, the driver's theft, my inability to tip the Negro, who was expecting me to play a character role too and give him a tip, got in the way, and they were edited out of my memory for 20 years. They were certainly edited out of the diary which I wrote with indelible pencil, already a little blunt, that evening in the hotel, on the hotel paper, for the extra drama. A family farewell in the morning, thousands of miles away, a farewell to my past, my colonial past and peasant Asiatic past. Immediately, then, the exaltation, the glimpse of the fields and the mountains which I had never seen, the rippled or wrinkled sea crawling, then the clouds from above, and thoughts of the beginning of the world, thoughts of time without beginning or end, the intense experience of beauty. A faint panic then, even enacted panic, then a dwindling of the sense of the self. A suppressed, half-true, but also half-intensely true, diary being written in a small dark room of the Hotel Wellington in New York. And already a feeling of being lost, of truth not fully faced, of a world whose great size I had seized being made at night very small for me again. I had come to New York with some bananas. I had eaten some on the plane and left the others behind. Guiltily but correctly, they would almost certainly have been taken from me by the authorities. I had also been given a roasted chicken or half a roasted chicken, my family's peasant, Indian, Hindu fear about my food, about pollution, and this was an attempt to stay it, if only for that day. But I had no knife, no fork, no plate, and didn't know that these things might have been got from the hotel, wouldn't have known how to set about asking, especially at that very late hour. I ate over the wastepaper basket, aware as I did so of the smell, the oil, the excess at the end of a long day. In my diary I had written of the biggest things, the things that befitted a writer. But the writer of the diary was ending his day like a peasant, like a man reverting to his origins, eating secretively in a dark room, and then wondering how to hide the high-smelling evidence of his meal. I dumped it all in the wastepaper basket. After this I needed a bath or a shower. The shower was in my own room, a luxury. I had dreaded having to use a communal one. One tap was marked hot. Such a refinement I had never seen before. In Trinidad, in our great heat, we had always bathed or showered in water of normal temperature. The water a tap. A hot shower. I was expecting something tepid, like the warm bathwater, in buckets, that my mother prepared for me, mixed with aromatic and medicinal neem leaves, on certain important days. The hot water of the Hotel Wellington shower wasn't like that. Hot was hot. Barely avoiding a scalding, I ducked out of the shower cubicle. So the great day ended. And then, it was my special gift, and remained so for nearly 20 years, helping me through many crises. I fell asleep as soon as I got into bed and didn't wake up again until I had slept out all my sleep. My memory retains nothing of the hotel room in daylight, nothing of the room in which I awakened. Perhaps, then, some embarrassment obliterated the memory. Less than 24 hours out of my own place, the humiliations had begun to bank up. To my own developed sense of the self was now added another sense of the self, a rawness of nerves and sensibility against which from now on for many years all my impressions, even the most exalted, were to be set. As were the impressions of the morning, the ones that remained with me, impressions that, after the humiliations of the previous evening, the humiliations of arrival, resumed the romance. The newsstand downstairs, in the lobby of the Wellington, was part of this romance. A little shop, in the building where one lived, it was quite new to me, quite enchanting. I bought a packet of cigarettes from the man who was selling, a tall, gray-haired man, as well dressed and formal and educated, I thought, as a teacher. Not like the Indian shopkeepers of our country villages, men who kept themselves deliberately dirty and ragged, the dirtier the better, to avoid hubris, to deter jealousy and the evil eye. Not like the Chinese in their parlors, who wore sleeveless vests and khaki shorts and wooden clogs, stayed indoors all the time, and in spite of their wizened, famine-stricken, opium-den appearance, fathered child after child unhappy black concubines or blank-faced, flat-chested Chinese wives. From the tall gray-haired man I bought a packet of old golds. I had no palate in tobacco, couldn't tell the difference between brands, and went mainly by things like names. In Trinidad only locally made or English cigarettes were sold in the shops. American cigarettes were available, informally and in quantity, because of the American bases, but they were never sold in the shops, and this ability to buy a packet of American cigarettes, from the whole range of American names, was wonderful. As was the price, 15 cents, and the book of matches that came with it. Largesse. The sensuousness of those soft American cigarette packets. The cellophane, the name of the brand, the paper of the packet outlining the shapes of the cigarettes, the thin red paper ribbon at the top of the packet which enabled you to undo the cellophane, the delicious smell. Cigarettes had always been for me an aesthetic experience. The flavor of burning tobacco I had never cared for, so the smoking addiction, when it came, had been severe. And if I had stopped smoking many times already at home, it was because I had for many months during the past worrying year been denying myself things, at one stage even, secretly, denying myself food out of a wish not to lose my scholarship, the scholarship that was to take me to England and Oxford, which was not a wish so much to go to Oxford as a wish to get out of Trinidad and see the great world and make myself a writer. Such passion, such longing had gone into this journey, which was less than a day old. From the teacher-like gray-haired man at the newsstand I also bought a copy of the New York Times, the previous day's issue of which I had seen the previous day at Puerto Rico. I was interested in newspapers and knew this paper to be one of the foremost in the world. But to read a newspaper for the first time is like coming into a film that has been on for an hour. Newspapers are like cereals. To understand them you have to take knowledge to them. The knowledge that serves best is the knowledge provided by the newspaper itself. It made me feel a stranger, that paper. But on the front page, at the bottom, there was a story to which I could respond, because it dealt with an experience I was sharing. The story was about the weather. Apparently it was unseasonably cool and gray for the end of July, so unseasonable that it was worth a story. Without the paper I would not have known that the weather was unseasonable. But I did not need the paper to make me see the enchantment of the light. The light indoors in the hotel was like the light outdoors. The outdoor light was magical. I thought it was created by the tall buildings, which, with some shame, I stopped to look up at, to get their size. Light indoors flowed into light outdoors. The light here was one. In Trinidad, from 7 or 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, the heat was great. To be out of doors was to be stung, to feel the heat and discomfort. This gray sky and gray light, light without glare, suggested a canopied, protected world, no need, going outside, to brace oneself for heat and dazzle. And the city of protected feeling streets and tall buildings was curiously softly colored. I hadn't expected that, hadn't seen that in photographs or read about it. The colors of the New York streets would have appeared to me, in Trinidad, as dead colors, the colors of dead things, dried grass, dead vegetation, earth, sand, a dead world, hardly colors at all. I went walking. In my memory there is only one walk. But I believe now that there would have been two, with a taxi ride in between, to check up on the sailing time for the ship that was to take me away that afternoon. Without the money in the suitcase I would have been penniless, so at least that precaution had served. I saw a cinema advertising Marius with Rama. The advertisement was in movable letters. I had never seen a French film in my life. But I knew much about French cinema. I had read about it, and I had even in some way studied it, in case a question came up in a French cultural, general, paper. So much of my education had been like that, abstract, a test of memory, like a man, denied the chance of visiting famous cities, learning their street maps instead. So much of my education had been like that, monkish, medieval, learning quite separate from everyday things. Marius, Rama. One name was like an anagram of the other, bar the S, my monkish way of observing, studying, committing to memory. And if it had been afternoon, and if I didn't have a ship to take, I would have gone, for at home that was where, imaginatively, I lived most profoundly in the cinema. Really, over and above that quirk of literary ambition, there was a great simplicity to my character. I knew very little about the agricultural colony in the New World where I was born, and of my Asiatic Hindu community, a transplanted peasant community. I knew only my extended family. All my life, from the moment I had become self-aware, had been devoted to study of the abstract sort I have tried to give some idea of. And then this idea of abstract study had been converted into an idea of a literary life in another country. That had committed me to further, more desperate, more consuming study, had committed me to further withdrawal. My real life, my literary life, was to be elsewhere. In the meantime, at home, I lived imaginatively in the cinema, a foretaste of that life abroad. On Saturday afternoons, after the special holiday shows which began at 1:30, and which we simply called 1:30, rather in the way other people might speak of matinees, it was painful, after the dark cinema and the remote realms where one had been living for 3 hours or so, to come out into the very bright colors of one's own world. But I had not seen any French films. They had never been shown in Trinidad. And perhaps, like British films, if they had been shown they would have found no audience, being of a particular country, local, not universal like the Hollywood pictures, which could quicken the imaginations of remote people. I knew French films from books, especially Roger Manville's film. I knew all the still photographs in that book. His reverential text, and the enthusiasm that had been given me at school for France as the country of civilization, made me see extraordinary virtue in those strongly lighted, poorly reproduced small photographs. And now, less than a day into my great adventure, seeing the name Marius and its near anagram Rama on the cinema board, I felt I was close to something that was mine by right, by education, vocation, training, yearning, sacrifice, like the New York Times itself, which yet, when bought by me, didn't hold me, being like a crossword puzzle I could only partly fill in. And a similar feeling of being let down by what should have been mine by right came when I found and went into a bookshop. Great cities possess bookshops, just as they had cinemas which showed French films. Colonial towns or settlements like my own didn't have bookshops. In the old colonial main square in Port of Spain, antique roofs and awnings of corrugated iron, once painted red or in alternate stripes of white and red, old carpentry, fretted gables with finials, decorative Victorian ironwork, architecture that spoke to me of our remoteness from the ports where that timber and decorative ironwork and corrugated iron were shipped. In the old colonial square there were emporia that sold school books and perhaps children's books and coloring books, and had perhaps as well a short shelf or two of Penguin books, a few copies of a few titles, and a few of the Collins classics, looking like Bibles emporia as dull as the emporia of those days could be, suggesting warehouses for a colonial population, where absolutely necessary goods, with a few specialist lines, like mosquito nets and the Collins classics, were imported and stored in as unattractive and practical a way as possible. And here, in the city of New York, was a bookshop. A place I should have entered as though I had journeyed to enter it. I loved books, I was a reader, it was my reputation at home. But the books I knew or knew about were few. There were the books in my father's bookcase, classics from the Everyman series, religious books, books about Hinduism and India. These last were bought from a trader in Indian goods in a petty commercial street in Port of Spain, and bought, most of them, as a gesture of Indian nationalism. Few of them were read by my father, and none by me. There were the books I had studied at school, there were the books I saw in the Central Library. Really, though, I knew only the classical or established names, the French, Spanish, and English books I had studied at school, and the very famous names my father had introduced me to. To enter this New York bookshop was to find myself among unhallowed names. I was traveling to be a writer, but this world of modern writing and publishing I had walked into was not something I was in touch with. And among all these unfamiliar, unhallowed names, I looked for the familiar, the classics, the uniform series, the very things I had looked at, with a feeling of deprivation and being far away, in the dark colonial emporia of Port of Spain, among the reams of paper and the stacks of exercise books, next to wholesalers of various kinds of imported goods, cloth, and coal pots. all in a warm smell of spices and damp raw sugar and various cooking oils from the wholesale grocers of South Quay, where there were donkey carts and horse carts and push carts among the motor trucks. This was an American shop, not one with English stock, the stock I was more familiar with. I settled then for the Modern Library series, and bought South Wind. This had been recommended to me by an English teacher who knew of my writing ambitions. I had despaired of finding this book in the Emporia of Trinidad. Here, part of the great wealth of New York, was the book, immediately available. I paid $1.28, and the assistant, who must have been 8 or 10 years older than me, called me Sir. South Wind. But it remained unread. My first attempt to read it was like all the attempts I made later. It showed me that, like the books of Aldous Huxley and D.H. Lawrence and certain other contemporary writers whose names had come to me through my father or through teachers at school, this book, with a young man called Dennis and a bishop, and an island called Nepenthe, was alien, far from anything in my experience, and beyond my comprehension. But the alienness of a book, though it might keep me from reading it, I never read beyond the first chapter of South Wind, did not prevent me from admiring it. The very alienness, the inaccessibility, was like a promise of romance, a reward, some way in the future, for making myself a writer. So much of my education had been abstract that I could live like this and think and feel like this. I had, for instance, studied classical French drama without having any idea of the country or the court that had produced this drama, without having the capacity to grasp the historical reality of France, and in fact quietly, in my own mind, rejecting as a fairy story all that I was told in introductions or textbooks about kings and ministers and mistresses and religious wars. These things were too removed from my experience, and I could not grasp them. I knew only my island and my community, and the ways of our colony. I had prepared essays on French and Soviet cinema simply by reading books and articles. I had learnt the great names of art and architecture in the same way. So, though now in New York I was a free man, and this was the first book I was buying in a great city, and the occasion was therefore important, historical for me, romantic, I took to it the abstract attitudes of my school education, the bright boy, the scholarship boy, not acting now for his teachers or family, but acting only for himself. Yet, with the humiliations of my first 24 hours of travel, my first 24 hours in the great world, with my increasing sense of my solitude in this world, I was aware, not having a home audience now, not having any audience at all, that I felt no joy. The young man in the shop called me Sir, and that was unexpected and nice. But I felt a fraud. I felt pushed down into a part of myself where I had never been. Less than 24 hours had passed since the magical vision of landscape, sugarcane fields and forested hills and valleys, and the crawling sea, and the clouds lit from above by the sun. But already I could feel the two sides of myself separating one from the other, the man from the writer. Already I felt a twinge of doubt about myself. Perhaps the writer was only a man with an abstract education, a capacity for concentration, and a capacity for learning things by heart. And I had worked so hard for this day and this adventure. With the new silence of my solitude, this solitude something I had never anticipated as part of the great adventure, I watched the two sides of myself separate and dwindle even on this first day. And that afternoon in New York, from a pier whose number I carried for many years in my head, but which I have now forgotten, a number not associated with romance but with humiliation and uncertainty, there began a journey on a ship of some days. Port of Spain to Puerto Rico to New York, by air. New York to Southampton, by ship. That journey by ship was for a long time, many weeks, many months, a long time to a boy of 18, my most precious piece of writer's material. Or so I saw it. And for a long time, in a boarding house in Earl's Court in London, in the dreariness of my college room in Oxford, and in the greater dreariness of a bed-sitting room in the holidays, using my indelible pencil or my Waterman pen or the very old typewriter I had bought in London for £10, more than a week's allowance for me, expensive, but new typewriters at that time, the war not being long over, were still not easily available. I wrote and cherished a piece I called Galanite. It was my first piece of writing based on metropolitan material. It was wise, It suggested experience and the traveler. Gala night. It might have been written by a man who had seen many gala nights. Knowing what it was doing, knowing the value of names, it played easily with great names: New York, the Atlantic, the SS. Columbia, United States Lines, Southampton, especially beautiful, as a name, this last. The gala night that provided the material for this piece of descriptive writing, it was not a story, took place on shipboard on our last full day on the Atlantic. In the morning we were to call at Cove in Ireland, then we were to dock at Southampton in the afternoon. Most of the passengers were to get off at Southampton, the others would get off the next morning at Le Havre. The gala night was a dance after dinner in one of the lounges of the tourist class. And it was disturbing to me to see, as from a distance, and as though I were studying a kind of animal life, since no shipboard romance had come to me, how the sexual impulse, like drink, clouded and distorted people I knew, men and women. To me, a lover of women but quite virginal at that time, the distortion in the women I had got to know was especially unsettling. There was a dainty girl who had spoken to me of poetry. How strange to see her now in the company of a man of no particular education or quality, and to see her moist-eyed, as though worked upon by forces outside her control. There was no recognition of me now in her eyes. And how distant, earnest, and preoccupied hitherto friendly men became, how impatient of conversation with me, conversation they had at other times welcomed. There was a man from San Francisco, an Armenian. He had fought in Europe during the war, and we had talked of the war and the soldier's life. He had told me that the only true war film he had seen was A Walk in the Sun. His thoughts were now elsewhere. Part of the trouble was that the gala night was also an occasion of drinking, and I at that time didn't drink at all. To win my scholarship, I had punished myself with study, and because I wished things to go well for me, I was full of ascetic self-castigations. In what I wrote I was recording my ignorance and innocence, my deprivations, of which the asceticism was a disingenuous sign, and frustration. But, gala night, in the intention of the 18-year-old boy who was doing the writing, was knowing and unillusioned. So that in the writing, as well as in the man, there was a fracture. To a truly knowing person the piece would have given itself away in more than one place. I concentrated towards the end of the piece on the figure of the ship's night watchman. He was standing outside the lounge where the dancing was taking place, and he had begun to address the disconsolate and unlucky men standing outside with him, men to whom, even on this wanton occasion, when dainty girls went dreamy and wild, no shipboard romance had come. He was as divided as I was, and perhaps the other men who were listening to him. There was a sourness in their silence. He, the night watchman, was lively. He spoke as a man who had seen it all. He was a heavily built man in his 40s. In the lecturing posture he had settled into, his hands, stretched out on either side of him, grasped the handrail against which he was leaning. He paused between sentences, to allow the wickedness he was describing to sink in. Looking at no one in particular, he pressed his lips together, and then, as if talking to himself, he started again. People changed after 3 days on a ship, he said. Faithful wives and girl friends became faithless. Always, after 3 days. Men became violent, and were ready to fight over women, even men with young and loving wives to whom they had just said goodbye. He said, or in many versions of Gala Night, I made him say, I have seen a captain make to kill a guy in this here place. Make to kill guy this here place. In addition to what he was saying, his lack of illusion about men and women, comforting in one way, that lack of illusion and the fierce judgment it implied, but also very painful, this account of a near universal wantonness that was nevertheless denied us. The night watchman talked like someone in a film. And that was why, as material, he was so precious to me. That was why the hard indelible pencil traced again and again, in those faint letters, which would brighten and turn purple when dampened, the words he spoke. In Gala Night, I looked for metropolitan material. I stuck to people who seemed to me to have this quality. There was a man, originally from the Middle East but now in spite of his Muslim name entirely American, who said he was an entertainer. He spoke familiarly of famous stars whose films I had seen, And it never occurred to me to wonder why this entertainer was traveling tourist. He read me some of his material, after the usual 3 days. Material, that was what he called it, and the short and simple jokes were typed. That was impressive and strange and American, to me, that such trivial material should be typed, should be given that formality. As impressive as that was his way of talking of his time in animated cartoons. They made many cartoons at the same time, he said. We make them and we can them. Ken, I was entranced by the word, so knowing, so casual, so professional. Just as his material became part of mine, so his language became part of my material as well. So that I was having it both ways with him, making use as a writer of his metropolitan knowingness, appropriating it, yet keeping myself at a distance from him, not on the ship, only in gala night, as though he, being only an entertainer, traveling tourist, and dubiously American, was a kind of buffoon, the kind of buffoon such a person should be, in writing of the sort I was aiming at, and as though I, now adrift, supported only by the abstractions of my colonial education, stood on firmer ground than he. 2 Salvation Army girls were also among my material. They were traveling to a conference somewhere in Europe, but they were ready to flirt. This flirtatiousness in religious girls struck me as strange. With my deprivations, I saw oddity where there was none. And there was a young man from the South. He shared the entertainer's cabin. He was heavy and pockmarked, and he wore glasses. In gala night, he appeared, and the scene was written so often by me that in my imagination he remains forever, in undershirt and underpants, sitting on the upper bunk, in the dim top light, peeling and eating an orange, and talking about girls, perhaps the Salvation Army girls. He said, looking down at his orange. I'm a plotter. I know what I want and I go get it, see? That was material for me. I could show the world, writing like that, observing things like that I knew the world. I could say in effect, I too have seen this. And I too can write about it. But there was another memory, disconnected from the first. In some versions of Gala Night I used it. In other versions I left it out. The young Southerner was talking about colored people. He said, nowadays they want to get in your bed and sleep with you. I was taken aback by that, and then amazed, that he, so full of racial feeling, could talk to me like that, as though he didn't see me racially. But that topic of race, though it was good, familiar material, and could prove my knowledge of the world, formed no part of Gala Night. It was too close to my disturbance, my vulnerability, the separation of my 2 selves. That was not the kind of personality the writer wished to assume, that was not the material he dealt in. So that, though traveling to write, concentrating on my experience, eager for experience, I was shutting myself off from it, editing it out of my memory. Editing out the airport taxi driver who had overcharged me, the humiliation had been too great, editing out the Negro at the hotel. Nor, as a writer, could I acknowledge the other, hideous anxiety of my day in New York. The journey in a liner across the Atlantic should have been pure romance. The going aboard the ship that afternoon in New York should have been pure romance. But romance was in only one part of my mind, there was something else in another part of my mind. I was nervous about sharing a cabin. For months I had worried about that aspect of my journey across the Atlantic. I feared being put with aggressive or disagreeable or sexually unbalanced people. I was small and felt my physical weakness. I feared being assaulted. I feared attracting someone's malevolence. That had been a great anxiety for me. But when I went aboard the ship it had been miraculously resolved. Yet I could not, in Gala Night, wishing to be the kind of writer I wanted to be, write about that. The British vice-consul in New York had booked a passage for someone who, when he went aboard the ship at the pier in New York, was clearly seen not to be English and was a puzzle to the purser. I remember it only now, so successful was Gala Night in cutting out the memory. Only now, laying aside the material of Gala Night, I remember having to stand about for some hours while they decided where to put me. I would have been unplaced, would have been standing about, worried about my few pieces of luggage, even while the ship was leaving the pier. My sight of the New York harbor, and the famous skyline would have been tainted by that standing about. And then someone took a decision, and the issue was wonderfully resolved. I was given a cabin absolutely to myself in a higher class. And I was given a key to open the door that separated that class from the tourist class, where I was to continue to live and eat during the day. This was a wonderful piece of luck. Immediately, much of my anxiety left me. I thought it a very good omen for the future. I thought, still with the fear of sharing cabins, compartments, and hotel bathrooms, that I would be blessed with what I thought of then as traveler's luck. But that night, when I was asleep, there was a commotion that awakened me. The top light of the cabin was put on. There were voices. I knew what was about to happen. Someone was going to be put with me. Someone else from tourist was going to be given a key to the door, which for some hours that evening I had thought of as a very private possession, almost a secret, that separated the classes. And the top light, put on just like that, and the raised voices, were so inconsiderate. I closed my eyes. Like a child. Like someone practicing magic. If I pretended to be asleep, if I pretended to know nothing, then nothing might happen, and the people who had come in might all just go away. But there was trouble. The man who had been brought in was making trouble. He was rejecting the cabin. His voice was rising. He said, "It's because I'm colored you're putting me here with him." Colored. So he was a Negro. So this was a little ghetto privilege I had been given. But I didn't want the Negro or anybody else to be with me. Especially I didn't want the Negro to be with me, for the very reasons the Negro had given. And he wasn't to be with me. The top light went out, the cabin door closed. The people who had come in went out. And the Negro was no doubt taken back past the barrier door to tourist class and fitted into some crowded 3 or 4 berth cabin, but with white people. Satisfactory to him, the black man. But at what price, at what cost and strain and tension for the days of the journey across the great Atlantic. Frightening, that glimpse of another man's deprivation and drive. Yet I was also ashamed that they had brought the Negro to my cabin. I was ashamed that, with all my aspirations, and all that I had put into this adventure, this was all that people saw in me, so far from the way I thought of myself, so far from what I wanted for myself. And it was shame, too, that made me keep my eyes closed while they were in the cabin. He, the black man, sought me out the next morning in the lounge of the tourist class, to apologize. He was tall, slender, well-dressed, with a suggestion of boniness and sharpness below his fine, thin summer suiting, bony knees, sharp shins. He was well-spoken, quieter with me than he had been in the cabin. He had thought that the people from the purser's office were genuinely offering him a better and less crowded cabin when they led him beyond the tourist door. But when he saw me, he changed his mind. He knew that I had become the nucleus of a little ghetto. He knew the Americans, he said. What else did he tell me? What else was there to him apart from his racial passion? Was he so restricted? I remember nothing else. I remember no other meeting with him. A woman, young, but older than my 18, told me more about him one day on deck. He clearly had made an impression on some of the passengers. He was fatigued by American prejudice, the woman said, and she spoke of him with understanding and also a kind of admiration. He was going to live in Germany, she said. His wife was German. They had met when he was serving with the army in Germany. He had grown to like the German people. Strange pilgrimage. In Puerto Rico there had been the Trinidad Negro in a tight jacket on his way to Harlem. Here was a man from Harlem or Black America on his way to Germany. In each there were aspects of myself. But with my Asiatic background, I resisted the comparison, and I was traveling to be a writer. It was too frightening to accept the other thing, to face the other thing. It was to be diminished as man and writer. Racial diminution formed no part of the material of the kind of writer I was setting out to be. Thinking of myself as a writer, I was hiding my experience from myself, hiding myself from my experience. And even when I became a writer, I was without the means, for many years, to cope with that disturbance. I wrote on with my indelible pencil. I noted dialogue. I was aloof, a man who took notes and knew. Night and day a man stood in the bow of the ship, scanning the grey sea ahead. And when finally I landed at Southampton, I had for a short while the pleasing sensation that the ground moved below my feet the way the ship had moved for 5 days. I had arrived in England. I had made the journey by ship. The passenger terminal was new. Southampton, of the pretty name, had been much bombed during the war. The new terminal looked to the future, but passenger liners were soon to be things of the past. After the grey of the Atlantic, there was color. Bright color seen from the train that went to London. Late afternoon light. An extended dusk, new, enchanting to someone used to the more or less equal division of day and night in the tropics. Light dusk, at an hour which would have been night at home. But it was night when we arrived at Waterloo Station. I liked the size, the many platforms, the big high roof. I liked the lights. Used at home to public places, or those I knew, schools, stores, offices, working only in natural light, I liked this excitement of a railway station busy at night and brightly lit up. I saw the station people, working in electric light, and the travelers as dramatic figures. The station lights gave a suggestion, such as the New York streets had already given me, of a canopied world, a vast home interior. After 5 days on the liner, I wanted to go out. I wanted especially to go to a cinema. I had heard that in London the cinemas ran continuously. At home I was used to shows at fixed times. The idea of the continuous show, as the metropolitan way of doing things, with all that it implied of a great busy populace, was very attractive. But even for London, even for the metropolitan populace of London, it was too late. I went directly to the boarding house in Earl's Court, where a room had been reserved for me for the 2 months or so before I went to Oxford. It was a small room, long and narrow, made dark by dark bulky furniture, and bare otherwise, with nothing on the walls. As bare as my cabin on the Columbia, barer than the room I had had in the Hotel Wellington for that night in New York. My heart contracted. But there was one part of me that rejoiced at the view from the window, some floors up, of the bright orange street lights and the effect of the lights on the trees. After the warm, rubbery smell of the ship, the smell of the air conditioning in enclosed cabins and corridors, there were new smells in the morning. A cloying smell of milk. Fresh milk was rare to me. We used clean powdered milk and condensed milk. That thick, sweet smell of milk was mixed with the smell of soot, and that smell was overlaid with the airless cockroachy smell of old dirt. Those were the morning smells. The garden or yard or plot of ground at the back of the house ran to a high wall. Behind that high wall was the underground railway station. Romance? The sound of trains there all the time, and from very early in the morning. Speaking directly to me now of what the Negro in the New York hotel had spoken, the city that never slept. The bathrooms and lavatories were at the end of the landing on each floor. Or perhaps on every other floor, because, as I was going down, there came up a young man of Asia, small and small-boned, with a pale yellow complexion, with glasses, and an elaborate Asiatic dressing gown that was too big for him in the arms. The wide embroidered cuffs hid his hands. He gave out a tinkling "Good morning!" and hurried past me. Was he Siamese, Burmese, Chinese? He looked forlorn, far from home, as yet still full of my London wonder, my own success in having arrived in the city. I did not make the same judgment about myself. I was going down to the dining room, in the basement. The boarding house offered bed and breakfast, and I was going down to the breakfast. The dining room, at the front of the house, sheltered from the noise of the underground trains, subject only to the vibration, had 2 or 3 people. It had many straight-backed brown chairs. The walls were as blank as the walls of my room. The milk and soot smell was strong here. It was morning, light outside, but a weak electric bulb was on. The wall was yellowish, shiny. Wall, light, smell, they were all parts of the wonderful London morning. As was my sight of the steep narrow steps going up to the street, the rails, the pavement. I had never been in a basement before. It was not a style of building we had at home, but I had read of basements in books, and this room with an electric light burning on a bright sunny day seemed to me romantic. I was like a man entering the world of a novel, a book, entering the real world. I went and looked around the upper floor afterwards, or that part of it that was open to guests. The front room was full of chairs, straight-backed chairs and fat low-upholstered chairs, and the walls were as bare as the walls everywhere else. This was the lounge. I had been told that downstairs, but the air was so still, such a sooty old smell came off the dark carpet and the tall old curtains, that I felt the room wasn't used. I felt the house was no longer being used as the builder or first owner had intended. I felt that at one time, perhaps before the war, it had been a private house, and though knowing nothing about London houses, I felt it had come down in the world. Such was my tenderness towards London, or my idea of London. And I felt, as I saw more and more of my fellow lodgers, Europeans from the continent and North Africa, Asiatics, some English people from the provinces, simple people in cheap lodgings, that we were all in a way campers in the big house. And coming back night after night, after my tourist excursions through London, to this bare house, I was infected by its mood. I took this mood to what I saw. I had no eye for architecture, there had been nothing at home to train my eye. In London I saw pavements, shops, shop blinds, almost every other one stenciled at the bottom J. Dean, Maker, Putney, shop signs, undifferentiated buildings. On my tourist excursions I went looking for size. It was one of the things I had traveled to find, coming from my small island. I found size, power, in the area around Holborn Viaduct, the Embankment, Trafalgar Square. And after this grandeur there was the boarding house in Earl's Court. So I grew to feel that the grandeur belonged to the past, that I had come to England at the wrong time, that I had come too late to find the England, the heart of empire, which, like a provincial, from a far corner of the empire, I had created in my fantasy. Such a big judgment about a city I had just arrived in. But that way of feeling was something I carried within myself. The older people in our Asian Indian community in Trinidad, especially the poor ones, who could never manage English or get used to the strange races, looked back to an India that became more and more golden in their memory. They were living in Trinidad and were going to die there, but for them it was the wrong place. Something of that feeling was passed down to me. I didn't look back to India, couldn't do so. My ambition caused me to look ahead and outwards, to England, but it led to a similar feeling of wrongness. In Trinidad, feeling myself far away, I had held myself back, as it were, for life at the center of things. And there were aspects of the physical setting of my childhood which positively encouraged that mood of waiting and withdrawal. We lived, in Trinidad, among advertisements for things that were no longer made or, because of the war and the difficulties of transport, had ceased to be available. The advertisements in American magazines, for Chris Craft and Statler hotels and things like that, belonged to another, impossibly remote world. Many of the advertisements in Trinidad were for old-fashioned remedies and tonics. They were on tin, these advertisements, and enameled. They were used as decorations in shops and, having no relation to the goods offered for sale, they grew to be regarded as emblems of the shopkeeper's trade. Later, during the war, when the shanty settlement began to grow in the swampland to the east of Port of Spain, these enameled tin advertisements were used sometimes as building material. So I was used to living in a world where the signs were without meaning, or without the meaning intended by their makers. It was of a piece with the abstract, arbitrary nature of my education, like my ability to study French or Russian cinema without seeing a film, an ability which was, as I have said, like a man trying to get to know a city from its street map alone. What was true of Trinidad seemed to be true of other places as well. In the book sections of some of the colonial emporia of Port of Spain there would be a shelf or two of the cheap wartime Penguin paperbacks, narrow margins, crudely stapled, with the staples rusting quickly in our damp climate, but with a wonderful color, texture, and smell to the paper. It never struck me as odd that at the back of those wartime penguins there should sometimes be advertisements for certain British things, chocolates, shoes, shaving cream, that had never been available in Trinidad and were now, because of the war, as the advertisements said, no longer being made, such advertisements being put in by the former manufacturers only to keep their brand names alive during the war, and in the hope that the war would turn out well. These advertisements, for things doubly and trebly removed from possibility, never struck me as odd, They came to me as an aspect of the romance of the world I was working towards, a promise within the promise, and intensely romantic. So I was ready to imagine that the world in which I found myself in London was something less than the perfect world I had striven towards. As a child in Trinidad, I had put this world at a far distance, in London perhaps. In London now I was able to put this perfect world at another time, an earlier time. The mental or emotional processes were the same. In the underground stations there were still old-fashioned, heavy vending machines with raised metal letters. No sweets, no chocolates came from them now. But for 10 years or so no one had bothered to take them away. They were like things in a house that had broken down or been superseded, but remained unthrown away. 2 doors away from my boarding house in Earl's Court there was a bomb site, a gap in the road, with neat rubble where the basement should have been, the dining room of a house like the one in which I lived. Such sites were all over the city. I saw them in the beginning, then I stopped seeing them. Paternoster Row, at the side of St. Paul's Cathedral, hardly existed, but the name still appeared on the title page of books as the London address of many publishers. My tramps about London were ignorant and joyless. I had expected the great city to leap out at me and possess me. I had longed so much to be in it. And soon, within a week or less, I was very lonely. If I had been less lonely, if I had had the equivalent of my shipboard life, I might have felt differently about London and the boarding house. But I was solitary, and didn't have the means of finding the kind of society I had had for the 5 days of the Atlantic crossing. There was the British Council. They ran a meeting place for foreign students like me. But there one evening, the first time I went, I found myself, in conversation with a bored girl, turning to the subject of physical pain, a fearful obsession of mine, made more fearful with the war, and one further explanation of the austerities I practiced at various times. I began to talk of torture, and persevered, though knowing it to be wrong to do so, and was so alarmed by this further distortion of myself, more distorted than my behavior during the flight to New York, first with the Negro in Puerto Rico, then with the Englishwoman in the seat beside me, that I never went to that British Council place again, for shame. I had only the boarding house and that curious, mixed, silent company of English people, Europeans in limbo, and a few Asiatic students to whom English was difficult. And perhaps that boarding house life might have meant more to me if I were better read in contemporary English books, if, for example, I had read Hangover Square, which was set in the very area just 11 years or so before. A book like that would have peopled the area and made it romantic and given me, always needing these proofs from books, some sharper sense of myself. But in spite of my education, I was underread. What did I know of London? There was an essay by Charles Lamb, in a schoolbook, about going to the theatre. There were 2 or 3 lovely sentences, in another schoolbook, about the Embankment, from Lord Arthur Saville's Crime. But Sherlock Holmes's Baker Street was just its name, and the London references in Somerset Maugham and Waugh and others didn't create pictures in the mind, because they assumed too much knowledge in the reader. The London I knew or imaginatively possessed was the London I had got from Dickens. It was Dickens, and his illustrators, who gave me the illusion of knowing the city. I was therefore, without knowing it, like the Russians I was to hear about, and marvel at, who still believed in the reality of Dickens's London. Years later, looking at Dickens during a time when I was writing hard myself, I felt I understood a little more about Dickens's unique power as a describer of London, and his difference from all other writers about London. I felt that when as a child far away I read the early Dickens and was able with him to enter the dark city of London, it was partly because I was taking my own simplicity to his, fitting my own fantasies to his. The city of 130 years before must have been almost as strange to him as it was to me, and it was his genius to describe it, when he was an adult, as a child might have described it. Not displaying architectural knowledge or taste, not using technical words, using only simple words like old-fashioned to describe whole streets, using no words that might disturb or unsettle an unskilled or unknowledgeable reader. Using no words to unsettle a child far away, in the tropics, where the roofs were of corrugated iron and the gables were done in fretwork, and there were jalousied windows hinged at the top to keep out the rain while letting in light and air. using Dickens' only simple words, simple concepts, to create simple volumes and surfaces and lights and shadows, creating thereby a city or fantasy which everyone could reconstruct out of his own materials, using the things he knew to recreate the described things he didn't know. To Dickens, this enriching of one's own surroundings by fantasy was one of the good things about fiction. And it was apt that Dickens's childlike vision should have given me, with my own child's ideas, my abstract education and my very simple idea of my vocation, an illusion of complete knowledge of the city where I expected this vocation to flower. Leaving room at the same time, fantasies being what they are, for other, late 19th century ideas of size and imperial grandeur, which neither Buckingham Palace nor Westminster nor Whitehall gave me, but which I got from Paddington and Waterloo stations and from Holborn Viaduct and the Embankment, great Victorian engineering works. I had come to London as to a place I knew very well. I found a city that was strange and unknown, in its style of houses, and even in the names of its districts, as strange as my boarding house, which was quite unexpected, a city as strange and unread about as the Englishness of South Wind, which I had bought in New York for the sake of its culture. The disturbance in me, faced with this strangeness, was very great, many times more diminishing than the disturbance I had felt in New York when I had entered, as though entering something that was mine by right, the bookshop which had turned out to have very little for me after all. And something else occurred in those very early days, the first days of arrival. I lost a faculty that had been part of me and precious to me for years. I lost the gift of fantasy, the dream of the future, the far-off place where I was going. At home I had lived most intensely in the cinema, where, before the fixed-hour shows, the cinema boys, to shut out daylight or electric street light, closed the double doors all around and untied the long cords that kept the high wooden windows open. In those dark halls I had dreamt of a life elsewhere. Now, in the place that for all those years had been the elsewhere, no further dream was possible. And while on my very first night in London I had wanted to go to the cinema for the sake of those continuous shows I had heard about, to me the very essence of metropolitan busyness, very soon now the idea of the cinema, the idea of entering a dark hall to watch a moving film became oppressive to me. I had thought of the cinema pleasure as a foretaste of my adult life. Now, with all kinds of shame in many recesses of my mind, I felt it to be fantasy. I hadn't read Hangover Square, didn't even know of it as a book, but I had seen the film. Its Hollywood London had merged in my mind, perhaps because of the associations of the titles, into the London of the lodger. Now I knew that London to be fantasy, worthless to me. And the cinema pleasure, that had gone so deep into me and had in the barren years of abstract study given me such support, that cinema pleasure was now cut away as with a knife. And when, 10 or 12 years later, I did return to the cinema, the Hollywood I had known was dead, the extraordinary circumstances in which it had flourished no longer existing. American films had become as self-regardingly local as the French or English, and there was as much distance between a film and me as between a book or a painting and me. Fantasy was no longer possible. I went to the cinema not as a dreamer or a fantast but as a critic. I had little to record. My trampings about London didn't produce adventures, didn't sharpen my eye for buildings or people. My life was restricted to the Earl's Court boarding house. There was a special kind of life there. But I failed to see it. Because, ironically, though feeling myself already drying up, I continued to think of myself as a writer and, as a writer, was still looking for suitable metropolitan material. Metropolitan, what did I mean by that? I had only a vague idea. I meant material which would enable me to compete with or match certain writers. And I also meant material that would enable me to display a particular kind of writing personality, J.R. Ackerley of Hindu Holiday, perhaps, making notes under a dinner table in India, Somerset Maugham, aloof everywhere, unsurprised, immensely knowing, Aldous Huxley, so full of all kinds of knowledge and also so sexually knowing, Evelyn Waugh, so elegant so naturally. Wishing to be that kind of writer, I didn't see material in the campers in the big Earl's Court house. One Sunday, not long after I had come to London, I was invited to lunch by the Hardings. Mr. Harding was the manager of the boarding house, but I had seen almost nothing of him, or his wife. I had seen more of Angela, whose last name I seldom used and in the end forgot. Angela was Italian, from the south of the country. She was in her mid or late 20s, but I couldn't really tell. She was older than me, 10 years at least, and I saw her as very mature. She had spent all the war in Italy and had somehow fetched up, like many of her friends, in London. Angela had a room in the house and some kind of position, but I wasn't sure what the position was. She sometimes was in the dining room in the basement, serving the breakfasts, and sometimes she was there in the evening. She also worked on some evenings as a waitress in the Italian restaurant, the Venezia or some such name, not far from Earl's Court Station. She served the 2 and 6 or 3 and 6 dinners. I had the dinner there a few times. It gave me an indescribable pleasure to be in a restaurant where I knew the waitress, even though I didn't understand the menu and didn't particularly like the food. Angela was the first woman outside my family I had got to know. There was an easiness about her from the start. I found her very attractive and, still a virgin myself, was half in love with her. This acquaintance with Angela gave me, fleetingly, a little metropolitan excitement, told me I was far from home and in a great city in Europe. The boarding house, the underground railway at the back of the house, and the entrance to the many-platformed station just around the corner, the Italian restaurant, the waitress one knew. I liked the setting and the props. They were part of the drama. They gave me a sense of myself as a metropolitan man just for a minute or so. Angela gave me a certain amount of encouragement. She told me she liked me. She told me my color was like the color of some people in her country. But there was a man in her life, an Englishman she had met in Italy during the war. He was a rough, common man, liable to become violent. I never saw him. It was Angela herself who described her lover in that way, half asking you to condemn the man, half asking for sympathy for herself, speaking of the relationship as though it was something unavoidable. She said that one night, during a quarrel, he had become so violent that she had run out of the room or flat naked except for a coat which she had grabbed as she ran. She had decided after that to live by herself. That was when she had moved to the Earl's Court house. Her lover was absent. At least I never saw him. Was he in a foreign country? I gathered from things that other people said that he might have been in jail. But I didn't raise the question with Angela, and she didn't say. I should have asked her, but because of my feelings for her I didn't want to. She was loyal to this man nonetheless, and the encouragement she gave me was oddly chaste. Her room was open to me, but it was only when she had other visitors that she encouraged me to be playful, as though witnesses made my playfulness all right. She was more distant and careful when there were no other visitors. It was because of Angela, in fact, as Angela's friend, that I went to the Sunday lunch given by the manager, Mr. Harding, and his wife. Mr. Harding I had hardly seen. And even after this lunch, which became part of my metropolitan material, something I obsessively wrote about for many months, not only in London in the summer, but also later in Oxford in the autumn, altering the reality to make it fit my idea of what was good material, suitable for someone like myself to write about. Even after all that writing I have no impression of what the man and his wife looked like. The lunch was in a large room on the ground floor at the back of the house. The room at the front, choked with brown furniture and seldom used, was the lounge. The room at the back was not so full of furniture, but the walls were as stripped as the walls of the other rooms in the house, as though the war itself had visited some disaster, some looting, on the house. I gathered that this back room was part of the quarters or rooms that the Hardings enjoyed as managers of the boarding house. The tall windows looked out onto the garden, or, more properly, untended ground, that ran to the high brick wall of the underground railway station. There was a tree. There was a view of trees in neighboring plots. The ground was bare in the shadow of the brick wall of the underground station. It was not unpleasant to me. I liked the colors. I liked the feel of a space enclosed and shaded but cool. There were other friends of the Hardings. Mr. Harding was the star of the lunch. I believe he was drunk. He wasn't incapacitated, but he had been drinking. Mrs. Harding, again, I have no picture of her, and Angela looked after the serving of the lunch. Mr. Harding talked. He was not only the star, but also the comic turn. He had a strong idea of who he was, and he talked with the confidence of a man among people whom he knew, people who would laugh at his jokes and be impressed by his manner. Had he been drinking at home, in a room somewhere, or had he gone to the pub? I didn't have the social knowledge of London drinking to ask or to guess. I knew nothing about pubs. I didn't like the idea of pubs. I didn't like the idea of a place where people went only to drink. I associated it with the rum shop drunkenness I had seen at home, and was amazed that to ordinary people on the London streets a drunk man was comic, and not hateful. Just as I was slightly amazed now that Mr. Harding, drunk at the lunch table, should not be treated with contempt by his guests but with tolerance, and even respect. He was listened to. I cannot tell what sort of accent he had. It sounded good to me, like something from a film. The most memorable moment of the lunch came during the telling of a story by Mr. Harding. I have a memory of Angela chuckling while Mr. Harding spoke, and a memory of Mrs. Harding doing a kind of straight woman act. What Mr. Harding's story was about I do not remember. But there came a moment when he said slowly, his deliberate drunken accents filling the room, "One of my wives, Audrey, yes, Audrey." And then he spoke directly to Mrs. Harding. "Do you remember Audrey?" And Mrs. Harding, not laughing, not smiling, not looking directly at Mr. Harding, doing her straight woman act, Mrs. Harding said, "I loved Audrey. She was such a sweet kid." I was dazzled by that passage of dialogue. It seemed to me sophisticated, big city, like something in a film or play or a book, just the kind of thing I had traveled to London to find, just the kind of material that would help to define me as a writer. And in many of the pieces of writing I attempted, in London at the boarding house, and later in Oxford during the terms and then the holidays, I brought that passage in. Though I had no social knowledge to set it off, though, to put it at its simplest, I had no idea what Mr. Harding had been doing that morning, where he had come from, and where he would be going that afternoon, though I could hardly see the man or judge his speech, though I never even thought to ask whether he had fought in the war or had spent his time in Earl's Court drinking. Writing about Mr. Harding and that passage of dialogue, I had a setting. Sunday lunch in a big London house. In some of the writing I attempted I improved the condition of everybody. I improved my own condition as well, without overt boasting, because to have heard and recorded that passage made me as knowing as I thought a writer should be when he moved among people. So to me, as a writer, that passage gave as much pleasure as it had given to both Mr. Harding and Mrs. Harding. But what of Mr. Harding? What other clue do I have to a more complete person? Has he really vanished from my memory? Can I not recall more than an impression of middle-aged, baldish whiteness, and a lazy, deliberate way of speaking? Did he know that the 18-year-old among the guests at his lunch was a writer who would cherish those words of his and go up to his room and write them down? He couldn't have known. The sophistication, then, the play, was for the people at the table. It was a thing Mr. Harding could waste. And that little deduction, in retrospect, makes him more interesting than what I noted down about him at the time. My passion to gather metropolitan experience and material, to give myself stature as a writer, this over-readiness to find material that I half knew from other writers already, my very dedication, got in the way of my noting the truth, which would have been a little clearer to me if my mind had been less cluttered, if I had been a little less well educated. As I wrote that passage of dialogue between the Hardings, I often improved everybody's circumstances, as I have said. But now, with my experience of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips at the Manor House, and my knowledge of Bray the car hire man, I see that lunch in the Earl's Court boarding house as slightly less than it seemed to me even at the time. I see the participants as servants, in a degraded setting, the gentlefolk whom the servants were meant to serve being gone, with the war, and leaving a looted house, full of foreigners now. So possibly the deliberation of Mr. Harding's speech was not only the deliberation of the habitual drinker after drinking, but also the genteel precision of the servant, whose vowels might have betrayed him to people in the know. But at that lunch Mr. Harding was safe. To his English friends his sophistication and wit would have been part of a familiar and loved act, and his Englishness worked, wonderfully, for the foreigners present, for both Angela and me. If Mr. Harding was less than I made him in my writing at the time, then he was also more. To make him grand in my writing, equivalent to his wit, I suppressed the boarding house background. But in suppressing aspects of the truth, I did more. I managed to suppress memory. And it was only when I began to concentrate on the lunch that Sunday for this chapter that I remembered that the lunch was special. For this reason, which I never mentioned in my writing, it was the Hardings' last lunch in the house. They had been sacked. They were to be replaced by Angela. So about the drinking and the wit and the byplay about one of my wives and Mrs. Harding's. I loved Audrey. There was an element of great and admirable bravado. But that was not the material I was looking for. It was not the material I noted. About Angela, I concentrated, in my writing, on her running away at night from the flat or room of her violent lover, wearing only a fur coat over her nakedness. I knew the fur coat. Its quality I couldn't, and still can't, assess, but it developed for me an alluring sexual quality, as no doubt it had for Angela herself, telling the story of her near-naked night flight. The sexual detail suggested a sexual knowingness. It concealed the innocence of the writer. But I could do little with the material. Unwilling as a writer ever to fabricate, to invent where I had no starting point of knowledge, thinking of it as a kind of trespass, I came to the end of my Angela material very quickly. As with Mr. Harding, I didn't know where Angela had come from. Her past in London, her life away from the Earl's Court boarding house, was mysterious to me. New to London, I couldn't even begin to imagine the furnishings of her lover's room or flat, his family background, his geographical background, far less his conversation. And as mysterious was Angela's time in Italy. There was a story there, if it had occurred to me that there was. And there was a means of finding the story out. I could have asked her. But I never thought of asking her. I hadn't arrived at that stage. How had she met her lover? What had life been like in Italy during the war? What had happened to other people in her family? And the various Italians and Maltese and Spaniards and Moroccans of European origin who came to her room and were her friends, what were their stories? How had these people found themselves in England and in that Earl's Court area? The flotsam of Europe not long after the end of the terrible war, in a London house that was now too big for the people it sheltered, that was the true material of the boarding house. But I didn't see it. Perhaps I felt that as a writer I should not ask questions. Perhaps I felt that as a writer, a sensitive and knowing person, it was enough or should have been enough for me to observe. But there was a subject there that could have been my own, something that would have exercised my indelible pencil to good purpose. Because in 1950 in London I was at the beginning of that great movement of peoples that was to take place in the second half of the 20th century, a movement and a cultural mixing greater than the peopling of the United States, which was essentially a movement of Europeans to the New World. This was a movement between all the continents. Within 10 years Earl's Court was to lose its pre-war or early war hangover square associations. It was to become an Australian and South African, a white colonial, enclave in London, presaging a greater mingling of peoples. Cities like London were to change. They were to cease being more or less national cities. They were to become cities of the world, modern-day Romes, establishing the pattern of what great cities should be, in the eyes of islanders like myself and people even more remote in language and culture. They were to be cities visited for learning and elegant goods and manners and freedom by all the barbarian peoples of the globe, people of forest and desert, Arabs, Africans, Malays. 2 weeks away from home, when I had thought there was little for me to record as a writer, and just 18, I had found, if only I had had the eyes to see, a great subject. Great subjects are illuminated best by small dramas, and in the Earl's Court boarding house, as fellow guests or as friends of Angela's, there were at least 10 or 12 drifters from many countries of Europe and North Africa, who were offering themselves for my inspection, men and women, some of whom had seen terrible things during the war and were now becalmed and quiet in London, solitary, foreign, sometimes idle, sometimes half-criminal. These people's principal possessions were their stories, and their stories spilled easily out of them. But I noted nothing down. I asked no questions. I took them all for granted, looked beyond them, and their faces, clothes, names, accents have vanished and cannot now be recalled. If I had had a more direct, less unprejudiced way of looking, if I had noted down simply what I had seen, if in those days I had had the security which later came to me, from the practice of writing, and out of which I was able to take a great interest always in the men and women who were immediately before me and was to learn how to talk to them, if with a fraction of that security I had written down what passed before me, frankly or simply, what material would I not have had? For soon the time would come when I would look, professionally, for material for a London book about the time of my arrival, and then I would find very little. What remained in my memory was what I had written about obsessively in those early days, and much of that was about Angela's sexuality, the feel of her breasts when, sitting or reclining on the bed beside me in her room, our backs against the wall, and the room full of her strange friends, she had allowed me to press my hand against her breast, the shape of her mouth, the brilliant wartime red of her lips, and the feel of her fur coat. And the sight, thrilling and unexpected, of her apron in the restaurant. Of Angela's past and time in Italy I noted down nothing, never thinking to ask. I noted down only her railing against the Italian priests of the South, who became fat during the war, she said, when everybody else went hungry. I noted that down, I remember it now, because it was anticlerical. Anticlericalism, that was one of the abstract issues of European history that I had got to know about, from teachers' notes and recommended textbooks, at Queen's Royal College in Trinidad. History as abstract a study for me as the French or Russian cinema, about which I could write essays, just as I could write essays on French history without understanding, without having any idea about kings and courtiers and religious sects, any idea of the government or social organization of an old and great country. And how could my knowledge of the world not be abstract, when all the world I knew at the age of 18 was the small colonial world of my little island in the mouth of the Orinoco, and within that island the world of my family, within our little Asian Indian community, small world within small world. I hardly knew our own community. Of other communities I knew even less. I had no idea of history. It was hard to attach something as grand as history to our island. I had no idea of government. I knew only about a colonial governor and a legislative council and an executive council and a police force. So that almost everything I read about history and other societies had an abstract quality. I could relate it only to what I knew. Every kind of reading committed me to fantasy. I was, in 1950, like the earliest Spanish travelers to the New World, medieval men with high faith, traveling to see wonders, parts of God's world, but then very quickly taking the wonders for granted, saving inquiry, and true vision, only for what they knew they would find even before they had left Spain, gold. True curiosity comes at a later stage of development. In England I was at that earlier, medieval Spanish stage, my education and literary ambition and my academic struggles the equivalent of the Spanish adventurer's faith and traveler's endurance. And, like the Spaniard, having arrived after so much effort, I saw very little. And like the Spaniard who had made a long, perilous journey down the Orinoco or Amazon, I had very little to record. So, out of all the things I might have noted down about Angela's Italian past, I noted down only her anticlericalism. It was a confirmation of what had up till then been abstract. It thrilled me because I had expected to find it. The flotsam of Europe after the war, that was one theme I missed. There was another, linked to that. Shortly after she had taken over from the Hardings, Angela took me up to a room one Saturday afternoon to show me something, as she said. She behaved as though this something was something she had just discovered, something the deposed Hardings might have been responsible for. Though this couldn't have been true, Angela had been connected with the house for some time. She took me to a room on the second or third floor. It was a big and dark room, much bigger than mine. The curtains were closed. The room smelled of old dirt and urine, old unwashed clothes, old unwashed bodies. It was as though the smell hung on the darkness of the room, as though the darkness was an expression of the smell. There was an old man on the bed. He was the source of the smell. A stick was leaning on the bed. Angela said to the figure on the bed, "I brought someone to see you." He paid no attention. Playfully, and greatly to Angela's amusement, he took the stick that was leaning on the bed and tried to raise her skirt with it. She was showing me the old man and his sexual playfulness as an oddity. That was how I accepted it. She told me nothing else about him, and I didn't ask. The questions come only now. Had he come to the house before the war, when the lounge might still have been a lounge and the dining room perhaps a true dining room? Had he stayed there throughout the war, and was he too old now to move? Had the Hardings taken up his meals to him, and did Angela do so now? Was he utterly dependent on the people who ran the boarding house? If, as I thought, though at the age of 18 I had no means of assessing the age of old people, he was now about 80, it meant that he had been born in 1870. Born in the year Dickens died, the year Lord Alfred Douglas was born, the year the Prussians defeated the French. Or, considering it from another angle, the year after Mahatma Gandhi was born. As a young man he would have known people whose memories went back to the early decades of the 19th century. He would have lived among people to whom the Indian Mutiny was a recent affair. Now, after 2 wasting wars, after Gandhi and Nehru, he was ending his days in one of the big houses of Victorian London, a part of London developed in the Victorian time. And now the houses there, which had survived so much, were too big for the people, and the old man in the big dark room was like a stranger among the people who lived in the house. Against these houses there beat a new tide of people, like myself, and the other Asiatics in the house, and Angela and the other Mediterraneans, who still hardly knew where they were. I saw the old man once later. He was shuffling about one of the staircase landings. There was an odd, humorous seeming restlessness about his old face. It might have been that was the way the flesh and muscles on his face were now set. It was as though his face was, very slightly, twitching with age. He didn't look at me with any kind of recognition, he just had his fixed seeming smile. He was concentrating on his steps, and what for him would have been the long walk down to the hall and the street. It was summer, late August, but he was wearing an overcoat. It was dark blue and looked heavy. It might have been made to measure some time before. He was tall, and the overcoat, though he needed it for warmth, seemed too heavy for his shoulders. He had his stick. His smell preceded him and lingered after him. I suppose he was going out for a little walk. It would have taken him a long time to prepare. Did he have visitors? Where did he get money? I never asked. And when I came back to the boarding house for the second and last time, for the Christmas holidays after my first term at Oxford, I never asked after the old man, and Angela never told me anything about him. I never saw him then, and I suppose that he had died in the 12 weeks or so since I had seen him on the landing in his heavy blue overcoat. Such a link with the past, so precious to me, with my feeling for the past. Yet I didn't ask about the old man. It wasn't only that I was unformed at the age of 18 or had no idea what I was going to write about. It was that the idea given me by my education, and by the more cultural, the nicest part of that education, was that the writer was a person possessed of sensibility, that the writer was someone who recorded or displayed an inward development. So, in an unlikely way, the ideas of the aesthetic movement of the end of the 19th century and the ideas of Bloomsbury, ideas bred essentially out of empire, wealth and imperial security, had been transmitted to me in Trinidad. To be that kind of writer, as I interpreted it, I had to be false. I had to pretend to be other than I was, other than what a man of my background could be. Concealing this colonial Hindu self below the writing personality, I did both my material and myself much damage. To wish to ask questions, to keep true creative curiosity alive, creative rather than the mindless curiosity of gossip, forgotten about almost as soon as it is received, it was necessary for me to make a pattern of the knowledge I already possessed. That kind of pattern was beyond me in 1950. Because of my ideas about the writer, I took everything I saw for granted. I thought I knew it all already, like a bright student. I thought that as a writer I had only to find out what I had read about and already knew. And very soon, after Gala Night, and all my many writings about the Hardings and Angela, I had nothing to record and had to stop. Things, objects, endure. The little pad I had taken aboard the Pan American World Airways plane at Trinidad, cheap stuff, 5-cent store stuff, cheap ruled paper set in a folder or binder with envelopes in a pouch on the inside cover. The little pad was still with me, like the indelible pencil. But after that very first day, no true excitement had been transmitted to its pages. It recorded smaller things, false things. It recorded nothing. It was put aside. The pencil survived, continued to be used. Writing implements, whether pen or pencil, were not thrown away in those days. And that indelible pencil, which brightened only when water fell on it, grew shorter and stumpier, lasting on long beyond its purely literary duties. It wrote letters. It wrote my name on the front page of the books I bought, books which were many of them like South Wind, books of England associated with culture, which I had read about or which the more cultural of my teachers had recommended to a boy who was going to England to be a writer. The separation of man from writer which had begun on the long airplane flight from Trinidad to New York became complete. Man and writer both dwindled, the preparations of years seeming to end in futility in a few weeks. And then, but only very slowly, man and writer came together again. It was nearly 5 years, a year after Oxford was over for me, and long after Angela and Earl's Court had passed out of my ken, before I could shed the fantasies given me by my abstract education. Nearly 5 years before, quite suddenly one day, when I was desperate for such an illumination, vision was granted me of what my material as a writer might be. I wrote very simply and fast of the simplest things in my memory. I wrote about the street in Port of Spain where I had spent part of my childhood, the street I had intently studied, during those childhood months, from the security and distance of my own family life and house. Knowledge came to me rapidly during the writing. And with that knowledge, that acknowledgement of myself, so hard before it was done, so very easy and obvious afterwards, my curiosity grew fast. I did other work, and in this concrete way, out of work that came easily to me because it was so close to me, I defined myself, and saw that my subject was not my sensibility, my inward development, but the worlds I contained within myself, the worlds I lived in, my subject turning out to be a version of the one that, unknown to me, I had stumbled upon 2 weeks after I had left home and in the Earl's Court boarding house had found myself in the too big house, among the flotsam of Europe after the war. Until that illumination, I didn't know what kind of person I was, as man and writer, and both were really the same. Put it at its simplest, was I funny, or was I serious? So many tones of voice were possible or assumable, so many attitudes to the same material. Out of a great mental fog there had come to me the idea of the street. And all at once, within a matter of days, material and tone of voice and writing skill had locked together, and begun to develop together. I came in time to the end of that first inspiration. And in 1956, 6 years after leaving home, I could go back. 6 years! That was the time scale ship travel imposed on people. To go abroad was indeed to say goodbye. That large family farewell at the Trinidad airport, though conventional in many respects, did hint at the nature of the journey I had been about to make. 6 years in England. Travel was now to become more frequent for me, journeys more matter-of-fact. Yet every journey home and every journey back to England was to qualify the one that had gone before, one response overlaying the other. I went back in 1956 by steamship, traveling directly from England, experiencing the slow change in weather, noting with pleasant surprise the day when the wind began to blow, and it was not necessary to brace oneself, because the wind was mild and warm, experiencing the ritual of shipboard life, the extravagant printed menus, the officers changing from temperate black uniforms to warm weather white uniforms. After 13 days on the Atlantic I awakened one morning to silence. After 13 days and nights of the steamer's engines, the silence was something that filled the airs. We were at Barbados, and every porthole of my cabin framed a bright, shocking, beautiful picture, blue sky, white clouds, green vegetation. So that, at this first landfall on my first journey back home, I was momentarily like a tourist, seeing the publicized, expected thing. This was the way that as a child I had been taught to draw and color my island, the local scene. It was the way the mulatto curio makers of Frederick Street and Marine Square in Port of Spain, the people with stalls on the pavements below the overhanging upper floors of the old buildings, It was the way they painted the local scene for the visitors who got off the tourist ships of the McCormack line and walked about the town for an hour or so. I hadn't believed in that way of seeing. I had thought it was a convention, something for the posters, the advertisements in the American magazines. And indeed, the island that revealed itself to me when a party of us went ashore had no relation to those beautiful porthole pictures. The island of Barbados was flat. It looked worn out by sugarcane fields and people. The roads were narrow. The wooden houses were small, very small, and seemed to sit lightly on the flat land, to be insubstantial, though this island had been cultivated and peopled for centuries, and there were little children everywhere. The children were black. There was not in Barbados that mixture of races we had in Trinidad, and especially there was not in Barbados an Indian or Asiatic population. But after my 6 years in England, to come upon Barbados like this, suddenly, after 13 days at sea, was less like coming upon a landscape than like seeing very clearly an aspect of myself and a past I thought I had outlived. The smallness of that past, the shame of that smallness, they had not been things I could easily acknowledge as a writer. They were things that the writer of Gala Night and Angela and Life in London thought he had left behind for good. I was glad when the morning tour, in a shared taxi, was over and I could get back to the ship. As though there was safety in the ship, as though the next morning the ship wasn't to set me down at my own island. And I found, when I landed there, that everything had shrunk to Barbados' size. But much more than in Barbados, I was looking less at a landscape than at old, personal pain. 6 years before, and at that age 6 adult years was half a life, everything in Port of Spain was tinged with the glory of my goodbye to it. The cambered streets, the wooden houses, the big-leaved trees, the low shops, the constant view of the hills of the northern range in morning light and afternoon light. Everything was tinged with the excitement of departure and the long journey to famous places, New York, Southampton, London, Oxford. Everything was tinged with the promise and the fantasies of the writing career and the metropolitan life. Now 6 years later the world I thought I had left behind was waiting for me. It had shrunk, and I felt I had shrunk with it. I had made a start as a writer. But neither of the 2 books I had written had as yet been published, and I couldn't see my way ahead, couldn't see other books. 6 years before, I had been only a boy, following a fantasy, answerable to no one. Now my father had died, there were debts, there were family responsibilities. But I had no means of helping anyone, I could barely help myself. I had only a newly discovered talent, and the only thing I could do, the only way I could look after myself, was to be in England, no longer now a country of fantasy, but simply a place where as a writer I might make a living in a small way, from radio scripts and bits of journalism while I waited for the books to come. I left after 6 weeks. The scholarship that had taken me out to England in 1950 had given me the return fare back. This second trip to England was paid for by me, precious money from my very small store. I left on another banana boat, which went by way of Jamaica. I left the ship at Kingston and joined it again 3 days later at Port Antonio, where it was loading up with bananas, a memory of a green coastline, of dark green vegetation as in a lagoon overhanging a dark green sea, and an ache in my heart at my own insecurity and my consequent inability to enjoy the landscape. And then the ship took me north, to the shortening days of England in winter. The winter itself, the grey tossing seas, I didn't mind, on that nearly empty ship. Winter, in fact, I still liked for the drama, for the contrast with the tropics of my childhood. It was the uncertainty at the other end that bothered me, and the knowledge now that at either end of my own run, there was uncertainty. No scholarship money, no vague, warm idea of Oxford and writing at the end of the journey, no note-taking. No Angela and the Earl's Court boarding house, no sense of the big city centre, with the noise of the underground trains. Instead of Earl's Court, and its old Victorian grandeur there was a working-class Kilburn house of grey, almost black, brick in which I had a 2-room flat sharing lavatory and bathroom with everybody else. There was an English brewer on the ship, a tall, heavy, elderly man. I knew he was a brewer because I heard him say it to someone. I also heard him give his name and his title to the purser when he took a book from the small banana boat library. Giving his title, although there were so few of us on the ship. He, the brewer, 3 or 4 English ladies, a Jamaican mulatto, and I. The ladies played cards together. 6 years before, the brewer and these ladies would have been very closely studied by me. Not now. It wasn't that they were alien, and too far from my experience. It was that, having arrived at some intimation of my subjects as a writer, I was no longer interested in English people purely as English people, looking for confirmation of what I had read in books and what in 1950 I would have considered metropolitan material. One of the ladies ran a boarding house on the south coast of England. She had given herself a Caribbean cruise. I heard the words in her conversation, saw them in her eyes, could hear them in reports she would make to her friends when she got back. The experience itself seemed to matter less than the report she would make of it. What different values the words had for her and for me. Though we might have traveled on the same Fife's banana boats, the Cavina, the Golfito, the Camido, what different journeys we had made. For years later it had all changed for me, the world, my mood, my vision, that very Atlantic. In those 4 years, out of the panic of that winter return to England, I had pulled much work out of myself, had written a book which I felt to be important. And it was with a security that was entirely new, the security of a man who had at last made himself what he had wanted to be, that I went back to the island, 10 years after I had left it for the first time. And everything I saw and felt and experienced then was tinged with celebration. The hills, the spreading shacks, the heat, the radio programs, the radio commercials, the noise, the route taxis. That landscape, with all its colonial or holiday motifs, beaches, market women, coconut trees, banana trees, sun, big-leaved trees, had always, since I had known it, been the landscape of anxiety, even panic, and sacrifice. The education that had made me had always been like a competition, a race, in which the fear of failure was like the fear of extinction. I had never, as a child, felt free. On afternoons like these, where now in 1960 I could go for drives or dawdle over lunch, I had had to stay with the books. On nights like these, when now I could go visiting or could simply talk, I had had as a scholarship boy to study or memorize things to a late hour. My abstract learning had been dearly bought. If there was a place, at this stage of my career, where I could fittingly celebrate my freedom, the fact that I had made myself a writer and could now live as a writer, it was here, on this island which had fed my panic and my ambition, and nurtured my earliest fantasies. And just as, in 1956, at that first return, I had moved from place to place, to see it shrink from the place I had known in my childhood and adolescence, so now I moved from place to touch it with my mood of celebration, to remove from it the terror I had felt in these places for various reasons at different times. Far away, in England, I had recreated this landscape in my books. The landscape of the books was not as accurate or full as I had pretended it was. But now I cherished the original, because of that act of creation. And it was as if, then, having won through to a particular kind of achievement, and having come to the end of a particular kind of fear, my relationship with my island had come to an end. Because after this I never found in myself any particular wish to go back. When for one reason or another I did go back, I found that, having neither fear now nor a wish to celebrate, my interest in the island was satisfied, even sated, in a day. I might, on the way from the airport on the morning of an arrival, be struck by the colors, and think I would like to stay for many days or weeks. But after the first day and first night, and the first jet-lagged pre-dawn rising, and the first sight of the hummingbirds in the garden, I became restless, anxious to move on. People had no news. They revealed themselves quickly. Their racial obsessions, which once could tug at my heart, made them simple people. Part of the fear of extinction which I had developed as a child had to do with this, the fear of being swallowed up or extinguished by the simplicity of one side or the other, my side or the side that wasn't mine. It was odd. The place itself, the little island and its people, could no longer hold me. But the island, with the curiosity it had awakened in me for the larger world, the idea of civilization, and the idea of antiquity, and all the anxieties it had quickened in me, the island had given me the world as a writer, had given me the themes that in the second half of the 20th century had become important, had made me metropolitan, but in a way quite different from my first understanding of the word, when I had written Gala Night, and Life in London, and Angela. When, in 1960, with that mood of writer's celebration on me, as I have described, I began my first travel book, it was from my little colonial island that I started, psychologically and physically. The book was in the nature of a commission. I was to travel through colonies, fragments of still surviving empires, in the Caribbean and the Guianas of South America. I knew and was glamored by the idea of the metropolitan traveler, the man starting from Europe. It was the only kind of model I had. But, as a colonial among colonials who were very close to me, I could not be that kind of traveler, even though I might share that traveler's education and culture and have his feeling for adventure. Especially I was aware of not having a metropolitan audience to report back. 2. The fight between my idea of the glamour of the traveler writer and the rawness of my nerves as a colonial traveling among colonials made for difficult writing. When, the traveling done, I went back to London with my notes and diaries. To do the writing, the problems were not resolved. I took refuge in humor, comedy, funniness, the satirical reflex, in writing as in life so often a covering up for confusion. In order to do more of this kind of writing, it was necessary for me to acknowledge more of myself. I soon had the opportunity. Not long after finishing that first travel book, I went to India, to do another. This time I left from England. India was special to England. For 200 years there had been any number of English travelers' accounts, and latterly, novels. I could not be that kind of traveler. In traveling to India I was traveling to an un-English fantasy, and a fantasy unknown to Indians of India. I was traveling to the peasant India that my Indian grandfathers had sought to recreate in Trinidad, the India I had partly grown up in, the India that was like a loose end in my mind, where our past suddenly stopped. There was no model for me here, in this exploration, either Forster, nor Ackerley, nor Kipling could help. To get anywhere in the writing, I had first of all to define myself very clearly to myself. So, from the starting point of Trinidad, my knowledge and self-knowledge grew. The street in Port of Spain where I had spent part of my childhood, a reconstruction of my Indian family life in Trinidad, a journey to Caribbean and South American colonies, a later journey to the special ancestral land of India. My curiosity spread in all directions. Every exploration, every book, added to my knowledge, qualified my earlier idea of myself and the world. But Trinidad itself, the starting point, the center, it could no longer hold me. It was no longer connected in my mind with an Atlantic crossing, a journey by ship over a fortnight, with the ship ritual, the change of the weather, the putting back of the clocks every other morning, the colors of the sea and the sky, the waves and swells, the rainbow-shot spray, the dolphins, the flying fish that, once one entered Caribbean waters, flew at night at the ship's lights and could sometimes in the morning be found expiring, slippery and flapping, on the decks. Passenger ships no longer went to Trinidad or anywhere else. Trinidad was an airline halt, its airport the scene of matter-of-fact departures and arrivals. And it was easy for me to quell whatever longing I occasionally felt for the landscape of my childhood by recreating in my mind the tedium that I knew would come to me on the second day, after the glory of arrival and the glory of the first dawn. Then I accepted a commission from an American publisher to write a book for a series on cities. I chose my own city, Port of Spain, to write about, because I thought it would be easy for me and also because I thought there was little to write about. Trinidad, after its discovery and dispeopling, had not been peopled again or settled until the end of the 18th century. I thought of the project as the labor of a few months, journalism in hard covers. Then I discovered that the source books didn't really exist. The idea that historical truth is preserved somewhere in libraries, in semi-divine volumes, with semi-divine guardians, is something that many of us have, I suppose. But books are physical objects, created or manufactured to meet a demand, and there were no such semi-divine source volumes about Trinidad. I had to go to the documents themselves. Such an irritation, but then the documents began to draw me in, and the longer I stayed with them the harder it was to give up the project. The idea behind the book, the narrative line, was to attach the island, the little place in the mouth of the Orinoco River, to great names and great events, Columbus, the search for El Dorado, Sir Walter Raleigh. 200 years after that, the growth of the slave plantations. And then the revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution and its Caribbean byproduct, the Black Haitian Revolution, the South American Revolution, and the great names of that revolution, Francisco Miranda, Bolivar. From the undiscovered continent to the fraudulence and chaos of revolution, from the discovery and Columbus and those lush aboriginal Indian gardens he had seen in 1498 in the south of the island, along beaches I knew, wide beaches down which fresh water streams flowing from woodland cut little channels to the sea, where yellow Orinoco floods mingled with the Atlantic, from the discovery by Columbus, a man of medieval Europe, to the disappearance of the Spanish Empire in the 19th century. This was the historical span of my story. At the end of the period of my story, Trinidad, detached from South America and Venezuela and the Spanish Empire, was a full British West Indian colony, an island of sugar and slaves, the aboriginal population extinct, forgotten. And then, within years, slavery was to be abolished, sugar was to cease to be of value, and this little corner of the New World, all ideas of its promise now abandoned, was to sink into its long 19th century colonial torpor. While revolutionary Venezuela, no longer part of the Spanish Empire, was beginning its century of chaos. I could see, in the documents of this later period, the lineaments of the world I had grown up in. Asian Indian immigrants had come in the period of 19th century torpor. As a schoolboy I had assumed that torpor to be a constant, something connected with the geographical location of the island, the climate, the quality of the light. It had never occurred to me that the drabness I knew had been man-made, that it had causes, that there had been other visions and indeed other landscapes there. Reading the transcript, miraculously preserved, of the trial of a Negro slave for the murder of another slave in Port of Spain in the Spanish time, and picking up inconsequential details about the houses, the street life, the backyard or slaveyard love affairs and jealousies, I found I could easily think myself back into that Port of Spain street of 200 years before. I could see the people, hear the speech and accents. In that street I could see the origin of the Port of Spain street I had spent part of my childhood in, the street whose life and people had been the subject of my first book. That my Port of Spain street, which as a child I had studied with such intentness, could be material had come to me as an illumination in 1955, fully 5 years after I had come to England, 5 years after Gala Night, and Life in London, and Angela, and other attempts at metropolitan writing. That illumination was still to some extent with me. I was still working out, in my writing, all the implications of that discovery. But it was astonishing to me to discover that the street life I had written about had such a past, that the street life I had witnessed as a child, or something like it, had existed in Port of Spain in 1790. While Trinidad was still part of the great and old Spanish Empire, while slavery still existed, and was 44 years away from being abolished, when the French Revolution was still new, and the Black Haitian Revolution was still a year away. These references, to the Spanish Empire and the Haitian Revolution, would not have occurred to me when I had lived on the street. Even when at school I had got to know, as part of school learning, the historical facts about the region, they did not have any imaginative force for me. The squalor and pettiness and dinginess, the foul coops and backyards and servant rooms and the many little houses on one small plot and the cesspits, seemed too new. Everything in Port of Spain seemed to have been recently put together. Nothing suggested antiquity, a past. To this there had to be added the child's ignorance, and the special incompleteness of the Indian child, grandson of immigrants, whose past suddenly broke off, suddenly fell away into the chasm between the Antilles and India. So, just as at the moment of takeoff in 1950 in the Pan American World Airways plane, I had been amazed by the brown and green pattern of fields which gave my island the appearance of other places photographed from the air, so now I was amazed, reading the documents of my island in London, by the antiquity of the place to which I belong. Such simple things. Seeing the island as part of the globe, seeing it sharing in the antiquity of the earth. Yet these simple things came to me as revelations, so used had I been, in Trinidad, to roadside views, to seeing the agricultural colony at ground level, as it were, at the end of the Great Depression and the century-long colonial torpor. The landscape in my mind's eye during the writing of this book became quite different in its feel and associations from the landscape of the earlier books. The labor which at the beginning I had thought of as the labor of 6 months stretched to 2 years. Ever since I had begun to identify my subjects, I had hoped to arrive, in a book, at a synthesis of the worlds and cultures that had made me. The other way of writing, the separation of one world from the other, was easier, but I felt it false to the nature of my experience. I felt in this history I had made such a synthesis. But it tired me, and many months before finishing this book I thought I would put an end to my time in England, shed weariness, not only the weariness of the writing, but also the weariness of being in England, the rawness of my nerves as a foreigner, the weariness of my insecurity, social, racial, financial, put an end to the distortion of my personality that had begun on the very day I had left home, put an end to that journey which, in spite of the returns and other journeys in the interim, had remained the fracturing one that had begun that day when the Pan-American plane, taking me up a few thousand feet above the island where I had lived all my life, had shown me a pattern of fields and colors I had never seen before. I sold my house. A few weeks' writing remained, and in the house to which I moved I began to feel very tired. I used to have 2 baths a day. The first bath was after breakfast, to wash away the effects of the sleeping pill that had kept my mind quiet during the night, had stopped me dealing in words, solving the problems of various parts of my book, had stopped me seeing all these problems come together into one unsolvable and alarming threat. In daylight I knew that writing problems were solved one by one. The second bath I had at the end of the day's work. So morning and evening for 10 or 15 minutes at a time I soaked in warm water. One morning the idea came to me that I was like a corpse at the bottom of a river or stream, tossing in the current. I gave up the morning soak. But the idea of the corpse was hard to get rid of. It came back to me every time I had a bath. At last the book was handed in, and I could leave England. I had no long-term plans. I could think ahead only to the freedom of not having a book to write anymore, the freedom to spend each day as I chose, the freedom to move from place to place, to say goodbye. I intended to be a roamer for a while, to live the hotel life. I intended also, at last, to spend a little time in the United States. Before that, there was some journalism to do, pieces on the Caribbean islands of St. Kitts and Anguilla, then in the news, and a piece on Belize, British Honduras, my first piece on Central America. I went first of all to my own island, Trinidad. I wanted to see the island where I had been living in a new way in my imagination for the last 2 years, the island I had restored, as it were, to the globe and for which now I felt a deep romance. I found an island full of racial tensions and close to revolution. So, as soon as I had arrived at a new idea about the place, it had ceased to be mine. Through writing, knowledge and curiosity feeding off one another, I had arrived at a new idea of myself and my world. But the world had not stood still. In 1950 in London, in the boarding house, I had found myself at the beginning of a great movement of peoples after the war, a great shaking up of the world, a great shaking up of old cultures and old ideas. And just as my own journey had brought about a change in me and set me looking for new ideas and a resolution beyond anything I had imagined as a bright schoolboy at Queen's Royal College in Port of Spain, so restlessness and the need for a new idea of the self had driven many other people, including the people I thought I had, in every sense of the word, left behind. The muscular, weight-lifting Trinidad Negro in the tight, button-up sports jacket in Puerto Rico, on the way to Harlem, the other black man on the SS Columbia, handling himself carefully, returning to the life in Germany he preferred to his life in the United States, these men in whom, unwillingly, since I was Indian and Hindu, full of the tragedy and glory of India, I saw aspects of myself, echoes of my own journey and the yearning at the back of that journey. These men had been isolated in 1950, vulnerable, their nerves raw. There had since been many more like them. They hadn't all traveled to find fulfillment, or to be abraded. In Trinidad on my return now that rawness of nerves among black people had become like a communal festering. It couldn't be ignored. And so to return to my island in the Orinoco, after the 20 years of writing that had taken me to a romantic vision of the place, was to return to a place that was no longer mine in the way that it had been mine when I was a child, when I never thought whether it was mine or not. That romance was now a private possession. The island meant other things to other people. There were other ways of responding to a knowledge of the world or an idea of the past, other ways of asserting the self. The Negro in the Puerto Rico hangar and the man on the Columbia had asserted propriety, their wish to live within an old order, their wish to be treated as others. 20 years later, the Negroes of Trinidad, following those of the United States, were asserting their separateness. They simplified and sentimentalized the past. They did not, like me, wish to possess it for its romance. They wore their hair in a new way. The hair that had with them been a source of embarrassment and shame, a servile badge, they now wore as a symbol of aggression. To keep my idea of romance, I had, as before in Trinidad, but now in a new way, to look selectively. That had been necessary in London as well. Part of my story, in the history I had just written, concerned the first British governor of the island, who had been accused of illegally ordering the torture of an underage mulatto girl. All the witnesses in the case had been brought to London in 1803 and lodged for years at the expense of the government. One man had been lodged in Gerrard Street, Soho. The number of the house was given. The house still existed. But Gerrard Street, at the time I wrote, was full of Chinese from Hong Kong, restaurants, food shops, packing cases on the pavements. Could I see the past there? I could, when I looked above the Chinatown at ground level, the imperial backwash of the late 20th century. Above, in the flat facades, I could see a remnant of the late 18th century, could imagine the rooms. My knowledge of London architecture had grown beyond the Dickens-inspired fantasies. Now in Trinidad, leaving aside the people and the anger that was like madness, to see the landscape I had created in my imagination for the last 2 years, to look for the aboriginal, pre-Columbus island, I had to ignore almost everything that leapt out at the eye, and almost everything in the vegetation I had been trained to see as tropical and local, part of our travel poster beauty: coconut, sugarcane, bamboo, mango, bougainvillea, poinsettia, since all those plants and trees had been imported. Later, with the settlement and the plantations, the landscape of the past existed only in fragments. To see one such fragment, I looked at the drying up mangrove swamp, green thick leaves, black roots, black mud, outside port of Spain, ignoring the rubbish-strewn highway and the bent and battered median rail and the burning rubbish dump and the dust-blown shack settlement beyond the highway and the shacks on the hills of the northern range. From the top of Laventil Hill, among the shacks, I could imagine myself at the beginning of things if I looked selectively down at the Gulf of Paria, gray, leaden, never blue, and the islets in the Gulf. Private that view I forced on myself, private the romance. My vision of the history was not the vision that set the young black people marching in the streets and threatening another false revolution. The story had not stopped where my book had stopped. The story was going on. 200 years on, another Haiti was preparing, I thought, a wish to destroy a world judged corrupt and too full of pain, to turn one's back on it, rather than to improve it. After the book I had written, after my 2 years' exaltation, I saw this anger from two sides, from the side of the Negroes, the people with the hair, and also from the side of the Asian Indian community, the people mainly threatened, not black, not white. I went on after a fortnight to St. Kitts and Anguilla, to do my articles. St. Kitts was very small, 30,000 people. It had no Asian Indian population and therefore, for me, no personal complication. To the Negroes there I was just a stranger, someone not black, and with straight hair. Judgments could be as simple as that here. This absence of personal complication, the smallness, and the simplicity of the geography made the past extraordinarily graphic. St. Kitts was the earliest British colony in the Caribbean, established in a region from which Spain had withdrawn. In shape it was, apart from a tail, round. It had a central mountain, forested at the top, and the slopes, covered with even sugarcane, ran all the way down to the sea. The island was edged with a narrow asphalt road, and there were the little houses of the workers, descendants of slaves, along this road. Sugar and slavery had created that simplicity, that unnaturalness in the vegetation and landscape. In a shallow, dry ford not far from this literal road there were boulders in the sugarcane. These boulders were incised with very rough figures, Aboriginal Indian work, the earlier past, a reminder of the horror before slavery. No Aboriginal Indians now existed in St. Kitts. They had been killed off 300 years before by English and French. The rough carvings on those boulders were the only memorials the Indians had left. The accessible past was the English church and churchyard, in a tropical setting. No yews, instead, the palms known as royal palms, with straight and stout gray trunks, with grainy ridges all the way up like healed wounds, each ridge marking the place where a frond had grown. And how different, in this colonial setting, were the associations of an English churchyard from the associations of a churchyard in England. The past was also accessible in the 18th century main square, called Pall Mall, of the little town, where newly arrived slaves from Africa were put up for sale after being rested in the barracons. For 150 years in St. Kitts the memory of this past had lain dormant. Now, in mimicry of Trinidad and the United States and other places, the memory revived, when the memory had really ceased to humiliate, serving instead as a political stimulus, a communal rhetoric of sentimentality and anger. And in the island of Anguilla, even smaller than Street Kitts, not green, less productive, there was another aspect of that 300-year-old slave simplicity. The people of Anguilla were not pure black, they had their own past. They were separated by that past from the people of St. Kitts. The population of Anguilla, there were about 6,000 people in all, was made up of a few mulatto clans with British names. They had the vaguest idea of their history, of how they had got to that flat barrenness in the Caribbean Sea so far from the big continents, so far even from the other islands. Some people spoke of a shipwreck. I saw all this under the spell of the book I had written, the past I had discovered far away in England from the documents, and felt I had almost created, as much as my novels had been created. And still under that spell, I went on later to Belize. To do that, I had to go to Jamaica first. From Jamaica there was one airplane a week. It stopped at Guatemala City. In the dark airport building, beyond the jagged, mud-colored volcano craters that the airplane, landing, had shown, like giant anthills or like the extravagant towers of a fairy tale, on the level surfaces of which houses clung in clusters, in the lounge of the airport building, when I saw the faces of the short, plump girls behind the counter and saw the fresh vegetable or fresh pepper relishes in the glass case. I remembered that this was absolutely my first time in Central America, my first time in the land laid waste by Cortez and his successors. The girls were Chinese-looking, but they were not Chinese. That half-familiarity made them very strange, remote. And those chopped-up vegetable relishes in the glass case, they suggested a matching strangeness. Foods distinguish cultures and even historical epochs. What would the food of ancient Rome have been like? And I remembered reading somewhere that the chocolate drink consumed by the jar in Montezuma's court was drunk cold and bitter and spiced. In the glimpse of the strange food, in the strange, Chinese but not Chinese faces of the girls behind the counter, in the Spanish but not Spanish of the menu boards, in the fairy tale volcanic spires of the land outside, in the vegetables and flowers that grew unnaturally large and bright in the high, clear, temperate air, I had an intimation of the wonder of the New World and the tragedy and pathos of the Spanish usurpation. It was a short flight on to Belize City. Belize, British Honduras, the British intrusion on the coast of the Spanish Empire, the British mahogany colony, the origin of the Guatemalan claim to Belize, the subject of my article, and the source of much of the Georgian furniture in the London salerooms. But there was no mahogany in Belize now. It had all been cut down. On the coast there would have been among the Negroes descendants of the slave mahogany log cutters. Inland, there was a Mayan population and there were mighty Mayan ruins. In the shadow of one such ruin a Mayan boy, whatever his private emotions, giggled when I tried to talk to him about the monument. He giggled and covered his mouth. He seemed to be embarrassed. He was like a person asking to be forgiven for the absurdities of long ago. Though there was no British colonial architecture worth the name in the mahogany colony, and all the monuments were Mayan. To the north, near the Mexican border, and still barely excavated, there was a whole Mayan town, abandoned centuries before the coming of the Spaniards, and now covered by forest, every tall, steep-step temple making a green hill. From London to Trinidad to St. Kitts and Anguilla, Guatemala City and Belize, the journey might have been planned by a man wishing to move backwards in time, to see his history take concrete expression. So that for many weeks after finishing my book I continued to exist in its aura and exaltation, finding confirmation of the world I had dreamed about and created from the documents. I had given myself a past, and a romance of the past. One of the loose ends in my mind had vanished, a little chasm filled. And though something like Haitian anarchy seemed to threaten my little island, and though physically I no longer belonged to the place, yet the romance by which I had attached it to the rest of the world continued to be possessed by me as much as the imaginative worlds of my other, fictional books. Still, there was no word about the book I had written from publisher or agent in the United States. The time came when I had to move on. I stuck to my original plan, which was to go to the United States, to travel for a while, using the advance I had hoped to get from the book. I left from Jamaica. It was February. The weather was bad in the north. The plane, just after it crossed Jamaica, landed again at Montego Bay. We stayed there for many hours. A hotel lunch was served by sulky, aggressive Negro waiters who had got too used to waiting on tourists and despised them. Once, more than 12 years before, in a time of anxiety and almost grief, I had left for England from Port Antonio on a banana ship, at the other end of the island. In the late afternoon we took off again, and the airplane flew and flew into the night, and then it flew around in the night. We flew for hours. We flew until our fuel was exhausted, and then we landed at Baltimore, to take on more fuel. Passengers were not allowed to get off. Baltimore was not an official port of entry. We took off again and flew some more. Like hijacked passengers. It was like the slow flight of 19 years before in the little plane of Pan American World Airways, a flight which had set me making notes in my cheap pad every hour. Now we were flying around and unable to land because of the weather, the snow. So we flew until we could land. We landed finally some hours after midnight. No coins, no knowledge of the different sounds made by American telephones. And landing in that great cold, I found the next day or that day that my book had been judged unsuitable by the publisher who had commissioned it, that the decision had been made weeks before, while on my journalistic travels I had been uplifted by my own vision of romance, the product of the writing, coming at the end of a vocation that had lasted 20 years. I had been briefly in New York twice since 1950, the year of my overnight stay. But the city I had seen on those later occasions had remained quite separate from the first city, the city of Ramu and Marius and south wind and the gray, seemingly canopied sky. It was only now, in a time of anxiety that was like the anxiety of my first arrival, that I thought to look for that city. It was only now that I could begin to acknowledge the humiliation the taxi driver had caused me when he had cheated me, the humiliation I had felt at not being able to tip the Negro in the hotel. I remembered the name of the hotel, the Wellington. I remembered its writing paper, on which for the sake of the drama I had written my diary on the night of my arrival. On this writing paper the letters that spelt out the name of the hotel sloped backwards, next to a drawing of what I suppose was the hotel building. Did the hotel still exist? My friend Robert Silvers, who had run my articles on St. Kitts and Anguilla in his paper, the New York Review of Books, said, "It's a hotel where musicians stay." And yet it was astonishing to me to come upon it one day, a working hotel in a busy street. It should have been an archaeological site, to match its mythical nature in my mind. So modest at pavement level, in spite of the drawing of the skyscraper on the writing paper. Door, lobby, none of these things I had remembered. The hotel had lived in my imagination rather than memory, like something from earliest childhood. An impression of darkness all around. I had arrived early in the morning, and was very tired and nervous. And within that darkness, sensations rather than pictures, eating the chicken over the wastepaper basket, avoiding the scalding water in the bath cubicle. Like dreams rather than memories, and yet suited to the occasion, for me, for on that day space and time had become one. Both space and time separated me from my past at the end of that day, and the writer's journey that had begun that day had not ended. I had planned to spend the advance for the book in the United States. There was no advance, but I stuck to my plan. I spent my own money. It was like watching myself bleed. Eventually, I moved away, west. And in Victoria, British Columbia, in a brand new rented flat, with rented furniture, I started work again. The writer's life, whatever one's mood, it was always necessary to pick oneself up and start again. I started on a sequence about freedom and loss. The idea had come to me more than 3 years before, in East Africa. It had come suddenly, during the afternoon of a day-long drive between Nairobi in Kenya and Kampala in Uganda. It had come as a mischievous, comic idea, matching the landscape and exhilaration of the long drives I had been used to making in that part of Africa. Now the idea was all that I had at the moment in the way of writer's capital, and it was touched with the mood of the historical book I had written, my disappointment, and the homelessness, the drifting about, I had imposed on myself. I had, as it were, and as had happened often before, become one of my own characters. After some weeks I came to the end of my original impulse, and could go no further with the writing. I lost faith in what I was doing. The days in Victoria, which had passed easily when I was writing, began to drag. And then I faced the simple fact that as a man who made his living by writing in English and had no American audience, I had only England to go back to, that my wish to be free of the English heaviness had failed, that my departure from my island in 1950, with all that it implied in homelessness and drift and longing, was final. From Victoria to Vancouver. The very tall stewardesses in the very short skirts, a dreadful frivolity. Toronto, London. The grind and grind of the airplane engines, hour after hour, stages in a return I didn't want. So that 20 years on I was making a journey that mimicked my first. If 20 years before I could have been granted a glimpse of myself as a writer, someone with a talent that had been developed, and with books to his name, I would have considered myself blessed. The blessing I felt as a blessing still, but, as with the pain that attends love, the disappointment that had come with the blessing I felt as a terrible solitude. I had no house. In London I rented a service flat in Dolphin Square. It consumed my money in steady installments, every week so much. The bills came up in a woman's handwriting, round, easy, the lower line of the writing creating a regular, almost scalloped pattern. The handwriting spoke of a woman absolutely at peace, sexually fulfilled, without anxiety. I envied her this calm, this absence of ambition. And when I went down to the office to settle the bill, I tried to work out which of the women it was, among the clerks who might have passed as wage slaves, which woman it was who, perhaps without knowing how blessed she was, had written out the figures of my fierce, debilitating demand. The summer was over. For the first time in England, after 19 years, I felt cold, imperfectly clad. Until this time I had had the same kind of clothes summer and winter, and had not felt the need for a pullover or for warm underclothes, or even an overcoat. I had longed for frosty weather, short days, electric lights in the early afternoon. Now, with this need for warm clothes, a need that seemed to grow and grow, I felt the winter as winter darkness. One day there were workmen somewhere below my window. They began to talk to one another. It was like listening to a play, different voices, careful dialogue, characters, sentences, ideas, showing off, acting style. In all my time in England I had never heard workmen talk like that, among themselves, so loudly, in the open air, for so long. It was a little frightening, this eavesdropping on what was like an unknown country. I knew another side of England, Oxford, people in broadcasting, writers. I had never been brought into contact like this with the country I had been living in for so long. I hadn't read about working men like the ones I was now listening to. I hadn't seen films about them. I went eventually to stay in a private house in the town of Gloucester. It was a wet day. The railway station was cold, damp, indicating the nearness of the River Severn. Gloucester, away from its grand cathedral, was a small, mean, common town. It was not a place I would have gone to out of choice. But now it offered a house, shelter, hospitality. The house was at the edge of the town, Mean houses making mean the fields they had been set down among, the pollard willows, the narrow tainted brooks in which industrial litter floated, willows and brooks-like features of city slum. It was not a house I would have chosen. But it was a home for someone and had been furnished like that and had the atmosphere. It was welcoming. At lunchtime on this first day the house also offered a coal fire. The French windows looked out onto a long narrow garden, scrupulously stripped and forked over for the winter. Far off were the sounds of a railway marshalling yard, oddly comforting at this distance. Everything about this house was welcoming and good. And in this unambitious setting I felt protected, isolated, far from every wounding thing I had known. For the first time in many weeks I felt at ease. That afternoon, in the front room of the house, where the furniture was old but cared for, I looked for the first time for weeks at the typescript of the book I had tried to get started on in Victoria, the sequence about freedom and loss. I found it better than I had during the writing. I even saw the sentence where it had come alive, a sentence written out of concentration, from within the mood created by the words. That critical creative moment had been missed by me in Victoria, perhaps because of my anxiety about what was to follow in the writing, and perhaps as well because of my anxiety about what was to follow Victoria. Now, recognizing the validity of that good sentence, I surrendered to the pictures the words created, the other pictures they trailed. I summoned up again, and sank back into the mood of Africa, the mood out of which the sentence had been written. I heard, or created, snatches of dialogue from different stages of my story. This particular story in the sequence was full of dialogue. I made brief notes. And it was only when I came back from the mood or came out of the concentration that I understood how far away I had been. In my early days as a writer, when my talent was declaring itself, I had developed, or discovered, this ability to concentrate and to compose in the midst of harassment, which was an ability, given a clear run of an hour or two, shorter periods didn't work, suddenly to withdraw, to shed even acute anxiety, like an engine cutting out when too much was asked of it. To push the world to one side and to enter my writing as I might enter a walled garden or enclosure, the image that often came to my mind. Writing strengthened me, it quelled anxiety. And now writing restored me again. My book was given back to me. I began to write slowly, day by day. The book of the summer was given back to me in the winter. Without the book and the daily act of creation, I do not know how I would have gone through that difficult time. With me, everything started from writing. Writing had brought me to England, had sent me away from England, had given me a vision of romance, had nearly broken me with disappointment. Now it was writing the book that gave savor, possibility, to each day, and took me on night after night. I had intended to stay for a week or so in Gloucester. I stayed nearly 3 months, unwilling, apart from everything else, to cut myself off from the good magic of the place. Several weeks of original composition lay ahead of me when I left Gloucester and went to Wiltshire, to the valley. For the first 4 days it rained and was misty. I could hardly see where I was. It was a good way of making the transition from the front room of the Gloucester house, which had been kind to me, kind to my African creation. It was good for the book, which was still in the delicate, suggestible state of its first draft. When a book was in that state, things around me could get written into it, could become part of the emotional charge of the narrative, and, once written into a book, hard to take out. So I tried, during the composing of a book, to avoid disturbance. And that Wiltshire Valley fog was right. In my imagination, at that stage of my story, I was living in a made-up Africa, a fairy tale landscape that mixed, according to my need, the high, rainy plateau of Rwanda with the wet, terraced, cultivated hills of Kijiji in western Uganda. As a child in Trinidad, I had projected everything I read onto the Trinidad landscape, the Trinidad countryside, the Port of Spain streets. Even Dickens and London I incorporated into the streets of Port of Spain. Were the characters English, white people, or were they transformed into people I knew? A question like that is a little like asking whether one dreams in color or in black and white. But I think I transferred the Dickens characters to people I knew. Though with a half or a quarter of my mind I knew that Dickens was all English, yet my Dickens cast, the cast in my head, was multiracial. That ability to project what I read onto Trinidad, the colonial, tropical, multiracial world which was the only world I knew, that ability diminished as I grew older. It was partly as a result of my increasing knowledge, self-awareness, and my embarrassment at the workings of my fantasy. It was also partly because of the writers. Very few had the universal child's eye of Dickens. And that gift of fantasy became inoperable as soon as I came to England in 1950. When I was surrounded by the reality, English literature ceased to be universal, since it ceased to be the subject of fantasy. Now, in Wiltshire in winter, a writer now rather than a reader, I worked the child's fantasy the other way. I projected the solitude and emptiness and menace of my Africa onto the land around me. And when 4 days later the fog lifted and I went walking, something of the Africa of my story adhered to the land I saw. I walked out between the stripped beaches and between the old, untrimmed yews, solid and dark green, and along the public road, past the cottages of flint and brick and thatch, but not yet seen clearly, and up the hill beside the windbreak to the barn at the top. I saw Stonehenge from a gap in the windbreak, a very wide view, the downs pimpled with tumuli and barrows. I walked down the hill to the farm buildings at the bottom. I asked a man the way to Stonehenge. He told me to go on past the farm buildings and then turn to the right, along the wide grassed way. Around the farm the ground was muddy, churned up by tractor tires. Water puddles reflected the gray sky. The grass on the grassed way, up the slope to the barrows from which a closer view of Stonehenge was to be had, the grass was tall and wet and entangling. Another day I walked along the public road in another direction, towards Salisbury. I came to a marked footpath. It was muddy, the mud deep. I turned back after about 200 or 300 yards. As once, 4 years before, in Kijiji in Uganda, getting out of the car one rainy afternoon to be in a village with separate little terraced hills and huts and afternoon smoke, wishing to be in the middle of that enchanting view, I had found myself mired in animal excrement, tormented by the stares and constant approaches of Africans, who were puzzled by my intrusion, and I had had to turn away, get back into the car, drive on. I didn't explore too much on the public road after that. I left all the marked public footpaths untrodden. I stuck to the downs, the grass-drove way, the walks around the farm at the bottom of the valley. And I continued easily in that rhythm of creation and walk, Africa in the writing in the morning, Wiltshire in the hour and a half or so after lunch. I projected Africa onto Wiltshire. Wiltshire, the Wiltshire I walked in, began to radiate or return Africa to me. So man and writer became one, the circle became complete. The Africa of my imagination was not only the source countries, Kenya, Uganda, the Congo, Rwanda. It was also Trinidad, to which I had gone back with a vision of romance, and had seen black men with threatening hair. It also now became Wiltshire. It was also the land created by my pain and exhaustion, expressed in the dream of the exploding head. A little over a year before, towards the end of the book about the New World, I had had the waking fantasy of myself as a corpse tossing lightly among the reeds at the bottom of a river like the one in the pre-Raphaelite painting of the drowned Ophelia, reproduced in the Nelson's West Indian Reader I had used in my elementary school in Trinidad. A river that turned out to be like the river in Wiltshire at the back of my cottage. Now every night at some stage an explosion in my head, occurring in a swift dream, giving me the conviction that this time I had to die, that this time I could not survive the great, continuing noise, awakened me. Such violence in my Africa, in the security of my stone cottage, where I had a coal fire every night. So much had gone into that Africa of my fantasy. As a point of rest, as a refreshment, a promise of release, I allowed myself to play, lightly, with the ancient Mediterranean idea that had come to me from the Chirico painting, the Enigma of Arrival. The empty wharf, the glimpse of the mast of the ancient ship, the doorways, the wicked, hypnotizing city towards which the two cloaked figures walk. For 2 days they had sailed, staying close to the shore. On the 3rd day the captain wakened his deck passenger and pointed to the city on the shore. There. You are there. Your journey's over. But the passenger, looking at the city in the morning haze, seeing the unremarkable city debris floating out on the sea, Unremarkable though the city was so famous, rotten fruit, fresh branches, bits of timber, driftwood, the passenger had a spasm of fear. He sipped the bitter honey drink the captain had given him. He pretended to get his things together, but he didn't want to leave the ship. But he would have to land. Such adventures were to come to him within the cutout, sunlit walls of that city. So classical that city, seen from the ship, so alien within, so strange its gods and cults. My hero would end as a man on the run, a man passionate to get away to a clearer air. In desperation he was to go through a doorway, and he was to find himself on the wharf again. But there was no mast above the walls of the wharf. No ship. His journey, his life's journey, had been made. It did not occur to me that the story that had come to me as a pleasant fantasy had already occurred, and was an aspect of my own. I had no means of knowing that the landscape by which I was surrounded was in fact benign, the first landscape to have that quality for me. That I was to heal here, and more, that I was to have something like a second life here, that those first 4 days of fog, before I went out walking on the downs, were like a rebirth for me. That after 20 years in England, I was to learn about the seasons here at last, that at last, as for a time as a child in Trinidad, I would learn to link certain natural events, leaves on trees, flowers, the clarity of the river, to certain months. That in the most unlikely way, at an advanced age, in a foreign country, I was to find myself in tune with a landscape in a way that I had never been in Trinidad or India, both sources of different kinds of pain. That all the resolutions and franknesses I was going to arrive at through my writing were to be paralleled by the physical peace of my setting, that I was to be cleansed in heart and mind, and that for 10 years I was to turn this landscape of down and barrow, so far from my own, into the setting for concentrated work. The man who went walking past Jack's cottage saw things as if for the first time. Literary allusions came naturally to him, but he had grown to see with his own eyes. He could not have seen like that, so clearly, 20 years before. And having seen, he might not have found the words or the tone. The simplicity and directness had taken a long time to get to him. It was necessary for him to have gone through a lot. A long time later, seeking as always a synthesis of my material, my worlds, my own developing way of seeing, I thought of the present book and returned to live in the past. And it was actually during the writing of the first chapter or section that I remembered something from the first week of my time in London, when I was staying in Angela's boarding house. My writer's ambition, my social inexperience and anxiety, had suppressed so much of that empty time, had expunged so much from my memory. I used to go out doing the sights. It was what tourists did. And one day, somewhere in central London, perhaps along the embankment, I saw someone from the SS Columbia sitting on a bench below a statue. He was like part of the monument. He was in a dark suit, a small man hot in the month of August. The month and the weather were fitted together later by the writer. He was tired. He had been doing the sights and possibly having as little idea of what he was doing as I had. Travel was a pleasure so much in the mind, so much something for later narrative. He was a butler, I thought, the man from the Columbia. Perhaps he had told me that on the ship, or perhaps I had made it up, finding in him a resemblance to a butler in some film. He was slightly offhand with me. It was as the night watchman had said during the gala night on the Columbia, when he had lectured those of us who were outside the dance lounge on the quirks of human behavior. After 3 days on a ship everyone was faithless, he had said. On shore, though, people became themselves again and forgot shipboard romances and even acquaintances. The butler was going on to France. A week there, no doubt in Paris, more sights, and then another ship would take him from Le Havre or Cherbourg back to New York, and the wandering holiday life would be over. He would be back home, free of hotels and the daily tramping and the fatigue and the strange food. And I passionately wanted to go with him. I didn't want to be his companion or talk to him or be in his house or apartment. I wanted to be as he was at that moment, a man on the move. I passionately wanted, though hardly arrived in London, to be free of London. I didn't want to go back home, though. I knew there was nothing there. I just wanted that day, trying to engage the offhand butler in conversation, trying to claim acquaintance with him in the strangeness of London. I wanted that day to feel that England was temporary for me too. Like the character in the story that came to me 20 years after, when I first came to the valley, I wanted to stay with the ship. More than 10 years after I had moved to the valley, when I was almost at the end of my time there, my time in the manor cottage, my second life, I was strongly reminded of my first week in England. I had a letter from Angela. I hadn't heard from her or about her for 30 years. Even her name had ceased to be familiar. It was something I had to fumble for when I thought back to those early days. And this letter from Angela was more than a word or a note. It was many pages long, written over many days and, as the handwriting showed, written in many moods. It was a round, fluent, thin-nibbed hand, now erect, now leaning to the right. Now the lines were straight, now crooked, now the letters were carefully shaped, now they moved up and down and were left unfinished. But the writing had an essential mode. It was the feminine English hand, round and fluent, the round shapes of the letters occasionally flattened, becoming wider than they were tall, edge shapes, speaking of a passive sensuality. The Englishness of the handwriting was a surprise. It was as though, purely by living in England, Angela had acquired that hand. The envelope carried the postmark of a town in Buckinghamshire, middle class, commuter country. The surname Angela gave, in brackets, at the end of her letter was English. I had forgotten her Italian surname, having seldom used it, but this English name seemed odd, seemed not to go with the person I knew. Yet she had given me an English name the first day we met. She called me Victor. She said that my Hindi or Sanskrit name was too hard for her, and she didn't intend to try to use it. 30 years later she remembered the name. Dear Victor. I was surprised. But perhaps no one, except very famous actors and dancers and sportsmen and people in the entertainment world who live by the physical admiration they receive from other people, perhaps no one forgets an admirer. And this may be truer of women, who as they get older must check over and count lovers and adventures. Dear Victor. And it worked for me, too, through all the intervening sensualities, all the uses to which I had put my body. The name Angela had given me called up the enigma and false promise of that early time in London, and Angela's waitress clothes and red lips. It even called up the feel of her fur coat, in which, according to her story, she had run away from her lover's room or flat one night when he had turned too violent. It called up the feel of her breasts, the liberty she permitted in her room. When other people, her friends, displaced people from Europe and North Africa, were there. It called up what I had very nearly forgotten, because there had been so much real writing since, my attempts in those days, out of my great ignorance, to turn Angela into suitable material. How often I had written about her, her breasts, her fur coat, how often I had introduced myself, how often I had improved or sought to improve everybody's circumstances. She had heard me on the radio, she wrote, she had heard me many times and even seen me on television, but hadn't thought of troubling me until now. She reintroduced herself. And she rewrote her past as once I had done. She said she managed the hotel in Kensington, where I had stayed before going up to Oxford. Nothing about the Italian restaurant in the Earl's Court Road. I don't think you know, but I had a daughter in Italy. My sister was looking after her until I could send for her. Well, Victor, this daughter is now a grown woman of 35 with children, and a lovely baby girl of her own, and speaking English you wouldn't know she was Italian. That was the end of the first part of the letter, all of it written in one kind of handwriting, regular, swift, strong, faltering only towards the end. After this the lines began to slope, the letters leaning more sharply, the spacing irregular. Much time, perhaps days, had passed since she had written the first part of the letter. I used to walk out with someone you didn't like at all. And to tell you the truth, Victor the First didn't care for him all that much. But it was the war, things looked different then, you get mixed up with strange people. You hate the priests, you don't care what they say, and you know that youth is ignorant. Walk out. Extraordinary language! I had never heard the phrase used by anybody. So dainty, quaint, so old-fashioned sounding and coy for Angela's association with a violent man who was a criminal, and was probably in jail when I got to know her. They had met during the war in Italy. She had been glad to follow him from the mess of Italy after the war to the peace and order of London, though of London she would have known as little as I. It got bad after you went to Oxford and stopped coming to the hotel. I was getting like one of these battered wives you read about in the papers these days, only I wasn't a wife. And he started coming to the hotel and carrying on. Many a time I thought I was for the sack. But then one day somebody came to the hotel. A tall man in a tweed jacket, and the second time he talked to me with his level steady gaze I felt he had been sent by God himself. Victor, you know I am no great believer, but I saw the hand of God there, I must say. I went to the Catholic Church and lighted a candle, which I hadn't done since I was a child. When your good friend heard what was happening, he came over hot foot to the hotel ready for blood. I don't know what he expected. But as soon as he saw the man he had to deal with, he went crazy. It was pathetic. It made me ashamed. He was like a man ready to cry. Class is class. I saw it then. The English gentleman, Victor, you cannot beat it. You cannot say you know England until you know the English gentleman. Our good friend went away with his tail between his legs, but then up to his old tricks as per usual. He began to telephone me, effing and dashing every other word, going on and on about the tweed coat. The man in the tweed coat married Angela, though again she knew as little of his background or the life to which he was taking her as she had done of the man she had first followed to England. She brought her daughter over from Italy, and they all lived in Buckinghamshire until her husband died. In Angela's letter, those many happy years were passed over quickly. The man who had given her those happy years was hardly a presence. Most of Angela's letter was about matters that had happened since the death of her husband, her savior. Most of Angela's letter was about her daughter, the daughter whom Angela had left behind as a child in Italy for some years, to follow, for very good reasons, her rough lover to London. The daughter had been brought over to live in Angela's Buckinghamshire house, had been sent to the local school. But suddenly, growing up, the daughter had declared herself Angela's enemy. The daughter's boyfriends had been wrong, according to Angela, and then the daughter's husband had been very wrong, had even been to jail. Daughter and husband tormented Angela, and this had become especially bad since Angela's husband had died. They had turned their children against Angela. They had forbidden Angela to come to their house. This was the burden of the largest part of Angela's letter. It was of this, rather than of the past, that she had settled down to write. This was the letter she had written at different times, in different moods, with different degrees of stability, in different versions of the handwriting she would no doubt have picked up from both her daughter, educated at the local school, and her husband. And this part of the letter was hard to read. It was very much like the letters I received sometimes from obsessed people, addressed to me, but not really meant for me. I couldn't read it in a connected way. I read it in snatches, jumping from page to page. But this I know, Victor, the little girl will grow up and learn to use the phone, though her mother doesn't think so, and the little girl will want to telephone her gran who loves her. You have my address and telephone number, Victor. The first don't have yours. Please telephone and let us meet and talk over the good old days, always the best, I say. I read this letter in my cottage. I felt my surroundings very acutely, felt their foreignness, felt the unrelatedness of my presence there. Beyond the garden wall, and where the water meadows began, were the great aspens. There had been 3, they had made a giant fan. I had watched them grow. In the gales of one winter I had actually been watching when 2 of the giant aspens had snapped, twice, leaving jagged, raw stumps. The stumps had grown to look less raw, there were powerful shoots from the stumps. I had trained myself not to feel grief for things like that. I had trained myself in the belief that change was constant. On the other side of the cottage, the view in one direction was of the water meadows, seen beyond the fast-growing wild sycamores and the tall, unpruned box hedge. In the other direction there were the old beeches, the yews, the dark, overshadowed lane to the road. Though I had never noted it down, I had had an intimation of a world in flux, a disturbed world, when I had first seen Angela and her friends in Earl's Court. We had both, it seemed, continued to travel versions of our old route. We had both made circular journeys, returning from time to something like our starting point. I didn't go to see her. I didn't telephone her. It would have been physically hard for me to go to where she was. And her disturbance, her instability, which perhaps had always existed and which perhaps as an ardent young man I couldn't see, preferring to see the shape and color of her mouth, her instability, created no doubt by the terrible war, and then her time in a London which she could hardly have understood, that was too unsettling to me. I preserved my own balance with difficulty. I was also deep in a book. My thoughts were of a whole new generation of young people in remote countries, made restless and uncertain in the late 20th century not by travel but by the undoing of their old certainties, and looking for false consolation in the mind-quelling practices of a simple revealed religion. Angela took me back to the past. I wasn't living there, intellectually and imaginatively, any longer. My world and my themes had come to me long after I had ceased to write of Angela. Her letter was soon covered over by the paper that accumulated in various piles in various places in my cottage. After some months it would not have been possible for me to get at it easily. She never wrote again.